Hello and welcome to the 13th Annual Women's Heart Symposium. I'm Nicole Weinberg.
Serena Vanderzee.
Christiane Scheffler.
Francesca Casalino.
And we represent the Women's Heart Center of Pacific Heart Institute and Have a Heart, Save a Heart charity. This year's meeting is going to be groundbreaking. We are tackling subjects that haven't been discussed in this type of forum before. In the face of the fires last year, we realized that shedding a light on how environmental toxins affect our everyday life was critical. It is a loose end in our understanding of risks and something that many people prophesize about, but most know nothing about. We have been spending a lot of hours reading and researching, almost making it difficult to put all the information we have for you in a one-day meeting. To lead this revolutionary meeting, we scoured the globe for the world's leading expert, and we found him. Today, you will get sound, concrete information on the mysteries of toxic chemicals. We sustained tragedies last year that deeply affected us all. How can we turn that disaster into something positive? That's what we're going to learn about today. Every year, we document this meeting through video so that it can be watched back for educational purposes. Our YouTube channel gets hits all year long, and we feel so lucky to be creating this catalog of resources for the community. We are continuing that hybrid format for this meeting, along with our wonderful AV team. If you or a friend have missed some of the incredible information presented today, know that we will have it online for you courtesy of Studio 721 in a few short days, so please tune in and share. For those of you in person, you'll hope you'll be enjoying our curated gift bags. In an effort to decrease plastic and other toxic chemicals, you've been gifted with non-plastic treats this year. They're actually very hard to come by in this world. And we are making up for years of throwaway plastic items with a more eco-friendly mindset. We're also thrilled to get copies of a book recommended by our keynote speaker, by the world-renowned Tatiana Schlossberg. We know you'll all read this masterpiece cover to cover. Additionally, we have so many raffle prizes, a silent auction, an annual raffle retreat, so don't worry if you joined us virtually. We'll have a lot of fun in store for you today. Also, we have the amazing Lon to engage you through the chat function on the live stream, so ask your questions there and don't forget to post pictures and videos on your social media and tag us at Have a Heart, Save a Heart. We owe everything to our community who have supported us for over a decade. Pacific Heart Institute and our incredible staff have quite literally been the best in the world. There is nothing toxic about them. What you all might not know is that we count on them for the creativity in making this meeting, for the raffle items, and for all the wonderful energy you see today. Additionally, the St. John's Hospital Foundation has been a wonderful ally, and we've all grown together. What started as a way to get our joint message out has grown into the Heart and Vascular Institute, Cardiac Rehab, Heart Week, and the Heart Health Wellness Festival, involving many leaders that are here today. Then there are our board members and our think tank, Irene, Libby, Meryl, Veronica, Lisa, and Cindy. It goes without saying that we couldn't have done this without you. We look forward to our rehash in the spring where we can cultivate new ideas for the coming year. Also, we need to thank our amazing sponsors and exhibitors. Please swing by their tables and learn what they have to offer. This meeting would not be able to happen without their generous support. If you haven't entered our raffle, please show your support by buying some raffle tickets. Winners will be drawn throughout the day. Lastly, please give a round of applause for our amazing volunteers helping keep today running on track. We would like to take a moment to thank Cedars-Sinai for sponsoring our CME accreditation this year. Thanks to them, we're able to offer 4.5 AMA, PRA Category 1, CME, and CEU credits for our doctors, PAs, RNs, NPs, PharmDs, and PhDs is here. Without further ado, the man with all the international accolades, Dr. Sanjay Rajagopalan is the globally recognized physician scientist whose work sits at the intersection of cardiovascular disease, environmental exposures, and public health. His research has reshaped how we understand the impact of air pollution, chemical contaminants, and the broad exposome of the heart, translating complex science into insights that directly influence patient care and prevention strategies. Today's keynote, Toxic Exposures to Transformative Exposomics Toward Holistic Frameworks to Understand Cardiovascular Health, challenges us to look beyond traditional risk factors and to confront the environmental realities shaping women's cardiovascular outcomes. We couldn't be more honored to present our keynote speaker for the Women's Heart Symposium 2026. Please help me give a warm welcome to Dr. Sanjay Rajagopalan.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Nicole. What a fantastic gathering, an annual gathering, and what a great effort putting this together. And thank you all for being here. Couldn't be happier. I was sort of reflecting on what my dress attire should be today in California, and that's always it's usually an easy decision, right? So you just get out of bed and you scramble in with casuals, but I was very deliberate in my dressing choices today. Normally I don't attire with a tie, I'm usually pretty cash, but I said I must attire with a tie to honor all of you here, for one, and secondly, to sort of set myself apart so that people can find me. But I was pleasantly surprised to note that many of you are formally attired here in California, so go figure. I'm also from MAGA country, by the way, but we won't go there. But part of the goal, in all seriousness, is when we're talking about environmental exposures and things like climate. It's a very politically charged environment, and I have to say, in having done this for many years, the path for healthcare practitioners is to go with the evidence and get everybody on board. You know, people who don't believe in the science, people who don't believe in the fact that environmental exposures might be a problem, lead with the evidence, show people the evidence, and serve as a bridge to convert minds and hearts, which is really part of the mission of the Save the Heart Foundation, is to really convert, people's practices to healthy dietary offerings, to risk factor control, and what we do in prevention. So this is all fundamentally important to us. And as healthcare practitioners, the only way to do this is to stay apolitical and present the evidence and hopefully convince people to recognize that this is indeed a major problem. Okay, terrific. I might actually look at the screen sometimes, so I'm sorry, I'd like to ambulate around the podium because I have a lot of nervous energy, but I'll try to restrain myself today and speak closely to the microphone because there's a live audience as well, right, following this. So I'm going to be very careful and stay restricted to this area. So let me present two patient vignettes, and this really is hopefully hits home for a lot of you, right? So this is a 64-year-old retired architect with prior coronary artery disease and a remote LAD stent who began his day as usual, coffee in his balcony overlooking the ocean. He lives in Pacific Palisades. But today the horizon was obscured by wildfire smoke. And you can check the date, January 15, 2025. Ash coating his railing. The air smells metallic. AQI of 268. I'm sure all of you in California probably look at the AQI once in a while, just checking in, right? So by late afternoon, chest pain begins. He has an inferior STEMI. And I recognize that a lot of you are also, some of you are the lay audience, so please forgive me. Some of the slides might be technical, but I'd really try to make this pretty simple so that you can follow along. So he develops a heart attack, an inferior heart attack, and because of plaque rupture, and goes to a cath lab and gets taken care of. A second scenario, this is an 81-year-old woman who lives in Venice, Oakwood, Venice, and she lives in a very small apartment in a very dense, crowded, low-income neighborhood. She's got type 2 diabetes, she's got coronary artery disease, hypertension, prior heart failure, relies on Social Security, keeps her windows open, has no air filtration, right? And this is the other reality of Southern California, right? As it is for many parts of the US, there's tremendous disparities in not only exposures, but also socioeconomic status. And that's a very important, as we all know, and as we'll discuss later on, socioeconomic status and where you are and what access you have is a major determinant of healthcare in the United States. Anyways, this was Jan 20th. She becomes confused. She develops chest pain. Unfortunately, she lives alone. And she does not call for help. Her relative finds her the next morning. And unfortunately, she expires. And she's found dead on arrival. So 2 different scenarios. And we'll explore this through the lens of what I'm about to present to you. The focus here is air pollution. But again, I'm going to weave in a lot of evidence from other environmental exposures that might be important. Now, I like to present this in front of cardiologists, and it's very apropos for a lay audience as well, so that you know what we do in cardiology. And I often say this I actually borrowed from my good friend who's an imager, Jim Min, who's always said, as cardiologists, we ask the right questions in the wrong order, right? And what does he mean by that? Well, in the 1970s, and Dr. Weinberg is here, Nicole's dad, who's actually a very respected member of the cardiology community. And he can tell you that back in the 70s, people were studying heart attacks and trying to figure out, what do you do about it? Do you keep people in the ICUs? How do you treat heart attacks? How do you treat rhythm disturbances, arrhythmias? And then they started focusing on ischemia, which is the blockage, and the blockage reduces blood flow, and that was the paradigm. And people focused on really trying to understand ischemia. So the consequences of low blood flow, right? That was the preoccupation, I would say, in the 1980s. And then people started focusing on, well, it's the ischemia, but let's really talk about the blockage. Let's figure out what's going on in the blockage. And that's what we call atherosclerosis, right? What is the biology of atherosclerosis? What happens? Do you have inflammation? All that stuff. So that's called atherosclerosis. That was a preoccupation in the 80s and 90s. But along the line, people were starting to think about risk factors. What really causes this in the first place? Let's go a little bit more proximate. Is it hypertension? Is it diabetes? Is it lack of physical activity? So you see that. So this is sort of the pyramid. But it's taken a while for us to zoom out a little bit and start thinking about what are the risk factors that are driving the pathogenesis of atherosclerosis that causes ischemia and heart attacks in the first place. And logical arguments, logical reasoning would predicate that you would sort of look at the proximate risk factors because that's probably a much more effective way of dealing with the problem in the first place, not downstream when the person's already had the heart attack, right? But now we're focusing on things like lifespan. How do you keep people alive longer? And we've, in fact, migrated from just thinking about chronology and thinking about how long to keep people alive, because keeping people alive in a nursing home till you're 95, it makes no sense, right? So let's talk about health span. How do you keep people functionally active and healthy, right? And that's a preoccupation in California. A lot of longevity clinics, as it is in many parts of the US, actually, people are focusing on treatments that might increase healthy longevity, right? So unfortunately, we have a medical system that rewards the wrong behaviors. These are called perverse incentives. And I have this thing on the left side that shows interventions that are high cost, high risk, and low cost, that could be low cost, that are primordial prevention techniques, where you're thinking it. And I think people are starting to think about this, quite frankly, where how do we have a health system that's going berserk, inordinately expensive, and what do you do about reducing costs? And maybe focusing on the primordial risk factors and rewarding the right type of preventive behaviors, and I know a lot of you are interested in prevention, is probably the right thing to do. It costs less, it saves money, and is a more primordial, proximate argument for preventing health. So we've taken the view that maybe, and I certainly like to think, that we are starting to really enter a new era in preventive cardiology, where we are examining health and health span from a wide-angle lens, where we're starting to look at larger factors, primordial risk factors, and the environment is a big part of it. You see this, you have the national environment, the personal environment, the social environment, and things like toxic exposures that might predispose you to things like stroke, heart attacks, etc. So here's a footprint of pollution in what I'd like to call, and this is a terminology that was coined many years ago by a Nobel Prize winning scientist called Anthropocene era, which refers to all types of exposures that are the consequence of human activities, right? So a conservative estimate of this is that environmental toxic exposures in particular result in 8.1 million deaths. It's the second leading cause of mortality globally, and it's really an underestimate. Some people say 12 million, but as I'll show you, environmental exposures are often hidden, and it's very hard to quantify what is an environmental exposure. And as I'll show you, many of these exposures take decades, right? Years to manifest. And clearly, when somebody has a heart attack, you don't have something on their forehead that says this is because of environmental exposures. It's very hard to attribute an event due to an environmental exposure. And that's what we call an attribution problem, where you can't really say for certain that certain events are related to toxic exposures. And this long delay or latency period is a big part of it, because it takes literally decades for this to happen. So how do you figure this out? It's an emerging science. And what you're seeing here is likely environmental exposure is probably the leading cause of global mortality and morbidity, but what we have is an underestimate. And this is a very closely interconnected set of drivers, as you can see here, because it all starts with fossil fuels. Now, fossil fuels are there for a reason too. They've made modern civilization possible in many ways, right? But we're also in an era of transformation, where there are other alternatives that are possible that could be better, that could lower the use of fossil fuel usage that drives a lot of these things. So air pollution being one of them, but related to it is water pollution, soil pollution, synthetic fertilizers. We talked about plastics, a lot of the chemicals that come out of these petrochemicals. So this is a massive driver of exposures. And we'll talk about that in just a second. And it turns out that the vast majority of health events, be it strokes, heart attacks, hospitalizations, relate to cardiovascular events. The primary reason people die of air pollution is not lung cancer, it's not asthma, it's heart attacks, strokes, and deaths related to heart problems, right? So that we know for a fact. So the vast majority of deaths, and that's also true for other environmental exposures. It turns out that many of the exposures work along very common pathways that lead to an excess of cardiovascular events. And it turns out that cardiovascular events are the leading cause of global mortality. People die more often because of heart attacks or strokes than they do because of cancer. Not that cancers are not important, clearly, but as if you count numbers, they numerically pose a larger problem than cancers do. Now, when we talk about air pollution, and going back to our patient vignettes, we are talking about particles that are less than 2.5 microns. These are called PM 2.5 particles. There are also smaller particles or ultrafine particles that can penetrate the lungs, enter the circulation, enter your brain, and cause a lot of problems. Of all of the components, now air pollution is a very complex mixture of chemicals, lots of different things, and it also changes in chemistry as it reacts with other components, with sunlight, a lot of things that happen. You're familiar with ozone. But of all of the things that you could say, if you ask me what is one thing in air pollution that causes health problems, it's PM 2.5. And it's a very simply calculated component. You don't need sophisticated equipment. You can have a purple air monitor or a monitor in your home. It'll give you a readout of what your PM 2.5 levels are. So it becomes very easy to deploy. It's recognizable, something that you can measure very easily and consistently associated with epidemiology. Now, this has been something, wildfires have sort of emerged as a problem within the last 10 years, and nobody could have predicted this, right? Before 2017, if you said to me or anybody, people studying this area, that wildfires could be a problem, I would have said, I don't know what you're talking about. But since 2017, there's been a huge surge in the number of wildfires in the United States, but also in the rest of the world. It's a massive global problem. And this slide depicts a paper in Nature that came out in 2020, I think 2023, so it's been a while. So what they did was they tracked all of the states within the continental United States to look at which states are actually showing increases in air pollution. And you see that very complex slide there. But what this is showing you is typically thanks to air pollution regulation, and California has been at the forefront of air pollution regulation. So congrats to all of you that live here, because you've made substantial contributions to changing the climate and the heat, no pun intended, and the politics of air pollution. Yet California stands apart. So it's been at the forefront. But thanks to air pollution regulation in this country since the 1970s, air pollution levels have dramatically lowered, right? So it's been, we have pretty clean blue skies and clean air in most of the country, most of the country, in California included. But since 2017, there's been a shift. There have been states, and you can see this, where wildfires have influenced stagnation, which means that air pollution levels, as opposed to progressive decline, are now stagnant, okay? And there are some states in purple, you can see on the right side, where wildfires have actually increased air pollution levels, right? So what you're seeing is a reversal of a trend where air pollution levels were dramatically declining and continuing to decline. And since 2017, there's been a shift thanks to wildfires. Nobody could have predicted this, several years ago. And as I said to you, this is just not a US phenomenon, it's a global phenomenon. Now, globally now, wildfires within the last 10 years kill as much as malaria and HIV globally, right? 1.53 million lives every year. And you can see this, you can't read the text at the bottom, but I wanted to show that because the vast majority of these deaths globally are because of cardiovascular reasons. Okay, now what do we know about the biology and the mechanisms by which pollution causes heart attacks? And this is just a cartoon here. And just to drive home the fact that these exposures, there is an acute phenomenon, and I showed you those patient vignettes where there's a sudden spike in air pollution, and it often tends to affect individuals or patients who have prior disease. And those are the two vignettes. You had one individual very wealthy, but nonetheless was living in a wealthy part of California, but had risk factors. And the other spectrum was an infirm, older individual with prior risk factors, including diabetes, a lot of other problems. So there's certainly that. So in this slide shows you a sudden blip in air pollution level. So you can see air pollution levels here. This is the air pollution levels on the y-axis, and you can see this black line showing progressive decline over many decades. And this could be the United States, actually. Now air pollution levels start to go up. And then within this little increase, there's a blip, there's an acute. These are all averages, you see. So there's a lot of, this going on, because an average is an average. So you can see a sudden increase in air pollution spike, and as a consequence, somebody could have a heart attack. And you can see a plaque build up here. So there are two things going on here. There's a long-term exposure to air pollution level over many, many decades that plays a role in causing some of the risk factors. And I'll show you data that air pollution can cause an increased blood pressure, can cause diabetes, insulin resistance, even Alzheimer's disease, right? So it's a toxin. But at the same time, there's also an acute phenomenon so there's a chronic biology and there's an acute biology to how these events occur. And this is what hopefully this graphic depicts. This is some data from calcium scoring data. This is a colleague of mine, Dr. Joel Kaufman, who studied calcium scoring in response to air pollution and showed that there is indeed a relationship between exposure, higher levels of air pollution, and higher levels of calcium. So higher levels of calcium are a surrogate for atherosclerosis, this disease that causes heart attacks in the first place. So showing an association between air pollution metrics and calcium scoring is suggesting that it's indeed involved in the biology of atherosclerosis. So this is what we think are mechanisms. Now, there are a few other things, and you can ignore this, but essentially those of us who study this know that things like oxidative stress, endothelial dysfunction, autonomic imbalance, plaque instability, increased thickening of the blood, or what we call thrombogenicity, can all result in heart attacks. And there's indeed good data suggesting this. Now, I wanted to show this because this is just not a US phenomenon, as I mentioned. This is data from China. This is involving 8.8 million admissions. And you can see little dots here. And you can see, and the little dots actually reflect higher levels of wildfire episodes. So you see it's a nationwide phenomenon, except perhaps if you go in the western part of China. But these are higher levels of exposure. And what it translates into is that 1 microgram of PM2.5 can result in a 0.16 increase in cardiovascular disease, 0.28% increase in ischemic heart disease. And look, you could look at this and go, well, this is a very small thing. But if you put the population together of a massive country like China, this turns out to be a pretty big number, right? So this is what this shows. I'll leave that. And now there are other mechanisms, and we'll skip this for a reason, because I think hopefully by this time, I've convinced you that there is a relationship between air pollution and cardiovascular events. I've also shown you data that wildfires can indeed influence your risk for heart attack. So I'll leave you with that. It's a little complicated. Those of you at the back might not be able to see this, but I'll walk you through this. This slide depicts the amount of blood pressure globally that could be related to elevated levels of air pollution. And the slide depicts areas of the world where air pollution is really a problem, like India, China, for instance, parts of the Middle East and Africa, where air pollution levels are much higher than you can imagine in this part of the world. And in those countries, a substantial portion of blood pressure, and those of you who are familiar with blood pressure know that you measure this in millimeters of mercury. And it turns out that even small elevations in blood pressure, a 2 millimeter elevation, can translate into an increase in heart attacks and stroke. So 2 millimeter increase translates into an 8% increase in major adverse cardiovascular events, so heart attack, stroke, and death, right? So 2 millimeter, 8% increase. Well, it turns out that some of the air pollution contributes in some locations to almost 4.4 millimeter mercury increases in blood pressure, right? And this is the rest of the world here, many parts of the world where you have 2 to 4 millimeter increases, and that's not trivial. So at a global scale, you see a phenomenon where elevated blood pressures can relate to an environmental exposure. So, and this is some of the math. I'll just leave you with that, but just the idea that a risk factor can have its origin in environmental exposure might be pretty interesting and new to some of you, right? And this is diabetes. I'll just say that there's plenty of evidence suggesting that air pollution exposure can do all of these things, including skeletal muscle insulin tolerance, liver fat accumulation, adipose inflammation or fat inflammation, immune system dysregulation, a lot of these things. And globally, 20% of diabetes-related deaths could be related to air pollution. And again, these are high exposure areas. So there are parts of the world the air pollution levels are high, population levels are high. So the impact on a large population can be substantial. Now, we'll get to metal exposures now in a second. So the whole range of metals that we are exposed to. I would say that the most important sources of exposures are depicted in the right. So 3 metals: lead, arsenic, and cadmium. So there are other metals too. There's certainly mercury exposures, but if you ask me currently, doctor, tell me which metals are probably the most important that I should be concerned about, those are the 3. You can see the sources of exposure. Cadmium exposure, as many of you might not know, actually originates in the soil. Smoking can give you cadmium exposures, but there's also green leafy vegetables that have cadmium in them, and you would never suspect this. And why? Because fertilizers, synthetic fertilizers that are used to fertilize soils where green leafy vegetables in California are grown, may have higher levels of cadmium. They're trapped in the leaf, in the body of the plant, and therefore you might get high levels of cadmium exposure. Arsenic, I'll tell you about arsenic exposures. Now, these are absorbed by the gut predominantly. Lead, for instance, lingers around for a long time. It concentrates in your bones. So bone specimens are actually pretty good ways of quantifying lead exposure in somebody. Of course, you don't do bone biopsies, but you can actually do autopsies on people and get a good estimate of what the lead exposure might have been 1,000 years ago, for instance, during the Roman civilization. It's very interesting, experiments like that. So the point is that these 3 exposures are associated with cardiovascular events, heart attack, stroke, and peripheral arterial disease. Now, arsenic in the US is a problem. I don't know how many of you know that arsenic could be a problem in the US. Okay, some of you. How about lead? Yeah, a lot of you are familiar with lead. So arsenic is a problem, especially in the southwestern United States, right? So groundwater, as you can see here, and this is a heat map showing you the areas in red and orange are particularly concerning, and yellow, and most of those are in the western United States, right? And there are many parts of the US that rely on groundwater, so it's probably a good idea to check whether you're being exposed continually at high levels of arsenic. Community water systems also have high levels, and this you can again see the mid part of the United States and the western part of the US are high levels of arsenic exposure. Now, arsenic exposure is very strongly associated with cardiovascular disease, no controversy, and this is some data from cardiovascular disease from Strong Heart, which is a very large epidemiological survey analysis, and looking at, and you see those lines going up, it means that higher levels of arsenic exposure in your urine. You can easily measure arsenic in the urine as an exposure, and that correlates with cardiovascular mortality. What about lead? Now, these are two very interesting experiments, okay? On the left is an experiment done in Dunedin in New Zealand, where they took about 565 young children at the age of 11 in the 1970s, okay, and happened to have their blood samples, so they measured lead levels at that time. And you can see at the bottom, the mean lead levels are about 11. In the US, mean lead levels have come down dramatically since the 1970s because of regulation, right? So lead levels have come down. Why? Because usage of not using lead pipes, petroleum, that had lead additions as an anti-knocking agent. That went away in the early 1970s, so we're not exposed as much. But back then, you can see what the impact is. These children on the left side were followed in Dunedin, in New Zealand, were followed over 4 decades. And they measured serial IQ tests on them. And one of the most important, horrific associations of lead exposure is the effect in cognition in children. Horrific. And you can see, and this has been shown many, many times, you can see that the change in these kids over 4 decades on their IQ is dramatic. And not only that, it was a very important predictor of where they wind up in society in terms of their socio-environmental, social-economic status, not socio-environmental, socio-economic status. So where they wind up, which is obviously related to cognitive skills, was not in a good place after these exposures. On the right side is a very interesting experiment done by Bruce Lanphier, who's a very famous epidemiologist, looking at lead exposures in this country. And people thought that, you don't really have to worry about low lead exposures because it's really a problem only when lead exposures are very high that you get these issues, like greater than 10, right? Number 10. But what Bruce shows, and you can see this here, on the and you can see the x-axis here where it shows you lead levels of 2.55, 7.5, 10, right? And you can see this relationship. And on the y-axis is what we call hazard ratio. Hazard ratio is your risk for having, this is looking at mortality. I think this is actually cardiovascular mortality, heart attack mortality, dying from a heart attack, right? And what this is showing you is your risk for dying from a heart attack. And you can see this continuous relationship to levels even lower than 5 microgram per DL. So that shows you even low levels of exposure associated with a risk for heart attack and total deaths. And the slide at the bottom, the figure at the bottom, shows you that concentrations of high lead in the blood contribute to roughly 400,000 deaths a year in the US. It's almost comparable to the number of deaths a year because of smoking. Now look at that. Much higher than what you would anticipate even with physical. So physical activity is protective, which is why it's blue. And alcohol consumption's more than 4 drinks a month, and shows you, alcohol is protective. But nevertheless, hypertension here is, we won't go there today, so maybe another discussion. So, all right, hypertension is here. This is an older paper, but nevertheless, you can see that the relationship is pretty dramatic, just to drive home the point that lead exposures are a major cause of annual deaths in this country, okay? All right, now what about plastics? Now this is a big, hot area. Everybody's interested in plastics, right? So, and this is, the problem is the plastics are ubiquitous. I mean, it's like, it's so pervasive and so inescapable. It's one hallmark of anthropogenic activity is plastic. So it's penetrated more than 1,300 aquatic species and terrestrial species. Not a single species, I think, that we are aware of that don't have plastic in their bodies, right? And every part of the environment, be it the Antarctic or Mount Everest, is plastic. So that shows that. So it's everywhere. And it comes in different flavors, obviously. We are interested as doctors and physician assistants and folks interested in healthcare in the microplastics and the nanoplastics. So microplastics are plastic less than 5 millimeters. Nanoplastics are those which are less than 1 micrometer. And why are we interested in size? Because those are they penetrate your human body easily. They absorb, they travel, et cetera, et cetera. Now, it turns out that plastics, when they undergo degradation in the environment, when you expose plastics to natural elements, and they are sort of weathered plastics hanging around on the beach for years, for decades sometimes, the plastics undergo chemical and physical transformation. And it's only then that the structure, biochemically, the structure of the plastic is opened up, and that's when it gets degraded, and those types of plastics are deleterious. So, and this is again emerging science. We don't know all the details, but to the best of our knowledge, it's degraded plastics that undergoes chemical, physical transformation, weathering in the environment that's responsible for, and it penetrates your ecosystems, right? So if you have beaches with plastics that are undergoing degradation, they contaminate your water, they're in your atmosphere, they're taken up by plants even, just like cadmium is. So they penetrate the ecosystem, and you're getting it to the air, you're consuming it in your foods, and you're drinking it in your water oftentimes. But there's still a controversy about whether the fresh plastics that come out of your water bottles, for instance, I mean, is it really toxic to you? I don't know. We don't know that yet. But this is a simple experiment that I happened to be involved with. I didn't design the paper. I happened to be part of it in terms of designing the protocol and helping with the analysis. But these were colleagues in Italy that did this experiment in Naples. 304 patients who they were having surgery done on their carotid arteries. And people have this surgery when they have blockages. They go back, the surgeons open up the artery and they remove the plaque. Essentially, it's called a carotid endarterectomy. And they did the surgery, and they used this as a clever experiment to figure out whether the plaque actually contains microplastics. So this is the design of the study, 304 patients. What they found was very surprising. They found components like polyethylene and polyvinyl chloride in about 70% of their cases, right? So 58% had polyethylene and about 12% had polyvinyl chloride. And when they looked at this in electron microscopy, many of them had these jagged appearance. You can see that here. And this often activates a lot of inflammation and creates inflammation within the plaque. So it's a smoking gun. We don't know that. But when they followed these patients over time, these patients who had higher levels of plastic, and this again is showing you this relationship. On the y-axis is incidence of heart attack, stroke, or death. So the higher, the more the events, the lower events. So people who had more microplastics had higher events compared to no microplastics. Now, again, this is these experiments are hard to do. I mean, how do you really figure out whether plastics are associated with heart attacks and strokes? And people have criticized this because there are a lot of what we call confounding factors. Because you could say, well, the folks who were having higher levels of plastics might be doing other bad things anyways, right? Maybe they had higher levels of exposures, higher levels of adverse activity. They were doing, lots of bad things that they were not supposed to do. And maybe that's the reason why, and the plastics are innocent bystanders. But my argument is quite simple, right? My argument is if plastics are hanging around in parts of your body and you think they're innocent, I mean, that doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't follow the sniff test of, this doesn't seem right to me, right? And then you have these jagged microparticles, you're associated with inflammation. So it's more than a smoking gun. But I will tell you that the science in this area needs to evolve. There's not an organ in the body that I'm aware of where they haven't found microplastics. There are studies showing In brains, obviously, high concentrations in liver tissue, in the heart, so many parts in the embryo, in the reproductive organs, everywhere. The question is, what are they doing there, and is it really harmful? And I would like to think that they're not just innocent bystanders. There's no such thing. There's no entity that I know that are just hanging out there and not doing anything to you in large concentrations. So we do have a lot of gaps in this area. There's also a substantial degree of controversy in the quantification of these chemicals. So a lot of the antagonists, folks in the petrochemical industry would say, and this is often, there's a whole lobby group, right, that comes out and says, you don't know what you're doing because you're not measuring it correctly, because the very test tubes that you collected your blood samples in is contaminated with plastics. So, I mean, this is your experiments are null and void. So a lot of technical difficulties associated with measurement of the plastic. So the current unknowns are really standardized methodologies. You also have to figure out dose response relationships. So typically in environmental exposures, you have to develop these very sophisticated ways of cause and effect. And that involves doing animal experiments, human epidemiology, putting all the evidence together. These are complex things. So it's not easy to kind of, I guess, peel the onion, shall we say. So there's a bridge, a chasm between causality and mechanisms, and certainly this has created problems for regulatory frameworks and policy because there's a big lobby group. It's a huge lobby group. I mean, think about it. It's the biggest oil manufacturers in the world, right? I mean, they're not just going to walk away and say, well, stop plastics. So this has resulted in problems with policy, in particular the Global Plastics Treaty, which would have been fantastic because in my neck of the woods, I'm going, well, look, there are parts of the economy and certainly parts of medicine that wouldn't be possible without plastics. Let's be real, right? Well, we got to use plastics there, no problem. But do we need single-use plastics? Do we need these plastic bags? Can we do away with some of these things? Heck yeah, we can. Right? So it's a very simple argument where use plastics where you need to and get away and come up with alternatives where you don't have to use plastics. And that would be great for health, fundamentally centered around health, but also good for, for the economy in many ways because it stimulates other ways of thinking about the environment, coming up with better ways, better technologies, what I like to call green technologies that are more health-centric. All right, enough on that. So now let's move to diet exposures. Okay, this is massive, right? I can't finish a talk on environmental exposures, toxic exposures without talking about diet because this is fundamentally the most important lever to optimize human health and environmental contamination. It's massive. Now, I often, depending on the audience, I sort of do a little trick. Since I'm in California, I think I'm in friendly territory, so I can talk about climate and things like this. So usually when I'm in Ohio, I hide this slide and put this away. Because my goal is to build bridges. My goal is not to alienate, folks that don't believe in the science, but to lead with evidence. So this is actually a friendly audience, so I'm going to show you this. So on the x-axis is risk for mortality. So here is risk for mortality. And the y-axis is average environmental impact. What do I mean by that? Well, the paper, they looked at the environmental impact on a particular food source. How does it affect the water? How does it affect soil? How does it affect environmental degradation in general, right? So what they did was to put together a group of foods, and they said, anything on this side of 1 is good for you from a cardiovascular health perspective, actually from a mortality perspective. So, and anything, if you go higher in the scale, it means it's environmentally bad for you. In other words, it has more of an impact on the environment. So this side, this is where you want to be. This is the sweet spot, right here. So you can look at that, nuts, legumes, whole grains, potatoes, vegetables, reduce your mortality, but also environmentally very less impactful. This is where you don't want to be. High impact, environmental impact, bad for you, increases mortality. And unfortunately, this flies in the face of our current nutritional guidelines, unfortunately, which no comment on that. So you'll have to talk to me outside of the venue. But on the right side is greenhouse gas emissions. And the way I frame this is, look, nobody's asking you to make special contributions to climate emissions. I mean, no. But do what's good for health. Do what's good for your cardiovascular health. What's good for cardiovascular health oftentimes has a lower environmental impact and lower emissions. Very easy. Eat less, walk more, try to avoid fossil fuel sources if you can. I mean, if you have to, in California and Los Angeles, you got to drive sometimes to get to work. There's no escaping that. So, of course, do that. But wherever possible, try to reduce your footprint. But it's also good for your heart. So it's very easy, to actually lead an environmentally responsible life as long as you're cardiovascularly healthy. So just do that. You don't have to believe in any of the political nonsense about climate, but just do what's good for you from a heart perspective and be selfish. Anyways, okay, but it's important because to change food systems is going to take a lot more than somebody, a couple of doctors speaking about this at a conference. This is a massive ecosystem, right? Multiple stakeholders, trillions of dollars, not billions, trillions of dollars at stake, right? And these people are just not going to walk over and let things happen, right? So how do you get them to a framework? So you've got to change policy. You've got to change the way food is made. You'll have to incentivize people because at the end of the day, it's all about incentives. And it's about behavioral incentives, okay, to change behaviors. It's about policy economic incentives so that you make this worthwhile for people, right, to change to a different system. So how does a meat manufacturer, what are they going to do? Like tomorrow, you got to do something. So create incentive, and it's possible to do that. Unfortunately, I think the United States has abdicated their premium position on the world stage to make these types of changes from a standpoint of innovation and transformation. And what I mean by that is green technology, measures in which you can transform ecosystems, but also transform economic systems to make it monetarily worthwhile. This is where I don't understand, the current, and this is the only political statement I'm going to make because it doesn't make any economic sense to me, where you could shift to a different model where you incentivize people, make lots of money, and this is after all the US of A, and get rich. And there's a way to do that, but anyways, but you got to transform this. I'm also going to talk about green exposures because this is important. This is, I think, a very poorly appreciated, but cheap and very effective intervention for health that people underestimate. Okay, and that's greenery. And I'm showing you this because this can be measured. Greenery can be measured with satellite technology at a 20-meter resolution level across the globe. So I can get you green exposures and know exactly how much of greenery is around your house to tell you how much of greenery you're being exposed to, right? So you can do that. It's measured using this technology, satellites called NDVI. There's tons of papers showing that higher greenery is associated with lower levels of heart attacks and mortality. Now, I'll be the first to admit there's a lot of confounders. So you could say people that live close to greener areas are probably wealthier. They take care of themselves. They do a lot more physical activity. Yes, of course, all of that stuff. But there might be more to this, right? So this is just some you might not be able to see this at the back of the stage here. But essentially, it shows you this side of this line is good. So it shows you the green exposures are good for you and reduces mortality. Now, there's something in Japan called Shinrikyo. And I don't know how many of you know this. This was introduced in the 1980s as a practice where you could go inside a forest. It's called forest bathing. But it's supposed to be a very sensual experience because you're supposed to pause as you're walking through it. And you smell, you touch. It's a very sensory experience. And it's very popular, by the way. And you can pay, some of these forest bathing experiences, you have to pay money for it. So they actually charge you for it. But this is the way we're going, right? You have to check into a luxury hotel with no Wi-Fi connection, and then you pay $1,000 for that. So this is the same kind of experience. They charge you for a sensory experience in the forest. You can do that for free in the Santa Monica Mountain somewhere, right? So, anyway, but this is good for you, it turns out. And previously we used to say, well, the benefits of green space are because of mental mindfulness. You feel relaxed, you walk more, right? And there's, very calming effect of greenery. But it's much more than that. It's much more than that. People are starting to recognize, this is a very interesting experiment. What they did was to take 11 individuals, had them walk around in a forest, and this was done, I think, somewhere in suburban Kentucky, which is where Dr. Bhatnagar lives. And what they did was they measured their blood levels to find chemicals that are associated with, and this is called limonene. Limonene is actually it's a very potent aromatic chemical that's released by greenery. And you can actually measure this in the plasma. So if you're exposed to these greenery, you actually are exposed to these volatile chemicals that you can measure. And there are thousands of these. You're just not measuring them. It doesn't mean that they don't exist. An example of this, where you can measure limonene, so you can see limonene go up in response to green exposure. That's pretty darn interesting, right? So many of these chemicals could have very salutary effects in your brain, how you feel in general, and in your cardiovascular health. But more on this later, but this is an emerging area of science, of environmental exposures. Now, we now get to the point of what do we do all about this? And this is a question that I often have. It's like you're talking about all these, planetary scale exposures, and what the hell am I supposed to do? I'm just a single guy in a clinic seeing 50 patients, doctor, and you're telling me I'm supposed to discuss all these environmental exposures? So what do I do? So this is a slide for those of you, to at least have a conversation with your patients about this. The first thing to appreciate and understand is that many of the chemical exposures and environmental exposures are not even known. So it's what I call, to use, who's the guy who came up with the known knowns, unknown unknowns, and the known knowns? Don Rumsfeld, right? So remember Don Rumsfeld, right? So Don Rumsfeld, so zone 1 chemicals are the known knowns, and you can see many of these exposures: noise pollution, air pollution, things that we know. And then there's emerging science, emerging factors, or known unknowns. And then you have the unknown unknowns. So I'm just talking about zone 1 now, the known knowns. And what can you tell your patients about it? Well, what I do normally, because I do, have a busy clinic as well. So I start with traditional risk factors. You deal with what you know. At least do your job in terms of making sure that patients' blood pressures are controlled, the diabetes is controlled, they're on the right medications. Talk to them about what they can do about physical activities. Maybe, even discuss some of the emerging risk factors like Lp(a). There are things in a lot of science in these areas. So you talk about some of the emerging risk factors, and you can ignore everything else. This fine print you can ignore. So focus on the traditional risk factors. Think about emerging risk factors. Optimize them. Try to do your best in lowering them, because that's your best bet. And then in the odd patient who comes in with, persistent cardiovascular risk or residual risk, or people who are recurrent events, it might be worthwhile thinking about some of these environmental exposures, right? I think in the future, it might be much more easy through the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning, where a patient fills out that we are developing, and I'll show you some of the tools that we're developing might do all the work for you. So I don't have to engage in doing a complicated environmental history, right? So AI and machine learning might solve some of the problems. So once you do that, in these patients, you would figure out whether they have additional conversations. In California, it might be worthwhile talking about where you live, whether it's close to wildfire exposures, whether you live close to a highway, and those types of things might be important. If you happen to live in the southwestern United States, a conversation about arsenic and lead might be appropriate. Midwest, I talk about lead in especially some of the communities in Cleveland. And then employ environmental risk mitigation strategies with things that you know to do and where there's science. What do I mean by that? One is, in this part of the country, if you happen to have risk factors, going back to our patient vignettes, patient with risk factors for heart disease, might be worthwhile to talk about protective equipment. Things like indoor air purifiers, and certainly in places of the world like New Delhi or Beijing, it's a necessity where you have indoor air purifiers that lower your air pollution levels, right? And there's good evidence suggesting that this is good for you. Even if you lowered air pollution levels acutely with an indoor air purifier or an N95 mask, you can actually change blood pressure, you improve endothelial function, you change heart rate variability, you change PI1, which is a thrombotic marker or high levels sticky marker, and reduce inflammation. And the evidence suggests, and this is a meta-analysis of at least 17 studies, randomized controlled clinical trials. So people have done randomized controlled clinical trials with air purifiers and shown that when you use an air purifier, it lowers blood pressure. No question. Okay, that I can tell you. And this lowers blood pressure. If you lower particle concentrations by 60%, you can get approximately a 4 millimeter reduction in blood pressure. In a marginal patient, that might be worthwhile doing. So I think I do recommend this. If you happen to be infirm, if you're taking immunosuppression, if you happen to have other comorbidities, it's worthwhile protecting yourself. For the average person who has an acute wildfire episode may not need to take these steps, but there's a lot of confusion in this area around what type of protection equipment you need to, take advantage of, or what you need to do. And hopefully that will change through better guidelines and better recommendations. So this is something that we'll put together for the American Heart Association. It's a little busy, but right at the center, you see comorbidity, special demographics. And what I mean by that is if you've been in the hospital, if you've been hospitalized, if you have heart disease, stroke, if you're high risk because of other reasons, those individuals absolutely need to be protected. And you can follow this algorithm where you take extra measures. Extra measures include avoiding those high pollution areas, wearing an N95 mask if you were to go out, using an indoor air filtration device, even looking at modern air conditioning systems that lower your exposure levels, right? And if you happen to live in a chronically exposed environment, like you happen to live in New Delhi, absolutely, I think you should talk about taking steps to reduce your exposure over time. Okay, now the problem is exposures don't occur in isolation. And I talked about this right at the beginning, right? So I talked about environmental exposures in two individuals, one with social factors, right? And social factors are big. Economic disadvantage is a big one. So there are fundamental challenges here. And the challenges are here, including the long latency period, et cetera. So I'll skip this and get to the meat of what I'm about to leave you with in the last 5 minutes. I'm almost done here. And that is an exposomic view of health, where we put these factors together, and we are in the age of AI, where we can take all of these factors together and use AI models to come up with a fingerprint of what your exposure levels are. And that's where we're headed towards. And there's tremendous opportunity in this area. This is what I call exposomic view of health, or a risk in person, time, place, context. So in other words, you have an understanding of where you live, what your exposures are in those areas, and put together a much more comprehensive view of your health rather than the relatively, restricted lens that we currently use to define your exposures. And a good example of this happens to be in Cleveland. I live in a neighborhood called Shaker Heights, and Van Aken Boulevard is a boulevard that divides, you can just walk a few feet on the other side and you're in a low-income neighborhood. And this side of it, home values are much higher. I'm sure LA has those areas on steroids. I mean, you have many areas that abut each other where you have such incongruence, shall we say, in socioeconomic status. And this happens to be a very important predictor of health. You've heard this aphorism, your zip code is a better predictor of your health than your genetic code, and that's true in many parts of the United States, right? So, and here you have the US map, where it shows you dark blue areas that are socioeconomically deprived areas, a lot of it, unfortunately, in the southeastern United States, but certainly the South, in Texas and parts of California, you have major disparities, and that's a very, very good determinant of health. Just living in those areas, high levels of mortality. And you see that here, where it shows you that higher the levels of SDI, and SDI is something which is an economic index defined as people living in poverty, and that's a very important predictor of health. So economics actually are baked into this. I'll skip this because it just drives home the point that people in the United States who die prematurely because of heart attacks have the same kind of factors that also drive obesity, right? In the bottom, you have obesity, and you look at it and go, well, those are the same areas, right? Same areas. And the same drivers, these are all the same things, right? Economics, poverty, living in crowded households, living close to highways, all kinds of things, and they're the same factors. So we have a number of these things where we can use to define the environment. And the way we do that is by using tools like this, where we can actually take pictures of your home, Google Street Views, and we can do this across the world. I could take Google Street Views, extract the features using AI, and I have instantaneously all your physical built environment. I also can take satellites to gather exposure data. The air pollution stuff that I'm talking about is all through satellite data. So I can get very good information on a number of chemical exposures through satellites, right? I can put this together in a model, and this is shown here. So it's very complicated. I can also take your genetic information, put that together in a model, and use that and use a variety of AI techniques. And this is sort of an AI neural net to use that to predict your survival. Prognostic meaning, is it going to be good for you, bad for you? Diagnostic, and finally, what was the other one? Prediction. All right, so this is one paper that I'll just show you where we did this across the United States and in multiple cities. And this is done in 7 cities, as you can see here, like Detroit, Cleveland, Brownsville. I don't think California is here. Or Fremont. Yeah, Fremont is actually an outlier because very well educated, as opposed to Cleveland, Detroit, which are industrial cities. So Fremont is actually put in there to reflect a modern city with educated populations and living in a good environment. But you can see that when we use the AI model to predict, this is the actual CHD as coronary heart disease, actual, and this is the predicted. And you can see all of them, the prediction performed very well. And we can also figure out what features in the street view is contributing to heart attacks. And it happened to be areas that are not very green. The green is actually good for you. A lot of pavements are not so good for you. So it can actually predict some of the features in the Google Street Views that correlate with high mortality. This is my final slide. I think, from a global perspective, I think all of this has a lot to do with policy. And there is a lot of synergy between drivers of climate and drivers of cardiovascular disease. So they are the same problems that cause cardiovascular disease that also drive environmental exposures and climate change. So this is what I call convergent cardiovascular solutions. So it's a win-win for heart health. It's also a win-win for the environment. So on the other hand, I think getting away or doing away with things like fossil fuel, but promoting green space, promoting renewable energy, local food production, less resource-intensive healthcare. These are all good things that can mitigate and improve cardiovascular health while reducing environmental impact. So I'll stop there. Thank you again for this wonderful opportunity. So nice to be here with you today.
Thank you so much. Your expertise and perspectives are invaluable from all of us. We thank you for everything you do for global cardiovascular health, and we'd like to present you with our keynote speaker award today.
Thank you.
All right. Next, we'd like to bring up our founder, Dr. Nicole Weinberg. She'll be leading off an amazing talk with fellow Have a Heart, Save a Heart board member and PHI partner, Dr. Christian Schaeffler. The talk is entitled Earth, Wind, and Fire, Effects of Air and Water Pollution on the Cardiovascular System. Please give them a round of applause.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I don't know why I'm following such a fabulous keynote speaker address, so I have to think about that for next year. But anyway, thank you all for coming. You can tune in as much to my talk or as little as you'd like. There might be a little bit of overlap. Earth, Wind, and Fire, Effects of Air and Water on the Cardiovascular System. So I'm going to touch on air pollution today. So air pollution, why is it important? Well, we all breathe air. And so it's very important to understand how our air affects our bodies. I think in the past, we've always understood that air affects our lungs. So we have lung issues and asthma associated with that, but it affects other organ systems as well, and particularly the heart. It affects for heart attacks, which we've talked about, strokes, different arrhythmias, congestive heart failure, and a multitude more. And it's kind of obvious that, it's everywhere. There's pollution throughout our universe. There's natural pollution from wildfires. There's cities with industry and factories. There's airplanes and car pollution. And so it's really throughout, and it's only getting worse. The statistics, I think mine are maybe a little bit more dated, but I found statistics that said that 7 million people are prematurely affected by air pollution, and about half of those are affecting the heart. So 3.5 million people suffer from cardiovascular disease that they wouldn't otherwise have if there wasn't this degree of air pollution. It is a World Health Organization epidemic. 25% of deaths are from heart disease, and another 24% from stroke. So one of the early studies that I was able to find is kind of interesting. It's from 2005, if you can believe that was one of the earlier studies, but it's linking the freeway pollution in Los Angeles by zip code with cardiovascular disease. And so this looked at residents in Los Angeles that were over age 40, and it showed that when they had high levels of this particulate matter, 2.5, that you had increased deposits of plaquing in your arteries. And so this one looked at our carotid arteries as a marker of disease, but the association existed despite gender differences, age, and being on lipid-lowering therapies. So they found that there was quite a connection between the air pollution surrounding our freeways and our risks of disease. So just to give you a framework, because it's in a lot of the research studies that I'm going to talk about, these arteries up here are your, These are your carotid arteries. This is the normal innermost lining of your carotid artery, and the subtlety of the plumping of the lining is there. And just to give you a frame of reference, this is what plaque looks like as it deposits in our arteries. And so what we're talking about is kind of real early plaquing. And it's really easy to come by because you can just put an ultrasound probe on the carotid artery and look to see if there are deposits there. So if we dial back to the key pollutants, we're looking at these different pollutants in terms of particulate matter and gases, so solids and gases. And the PM 2.5 is that really fine particulate matter that Dr. Rajagopalan had talked about already, and that is the stuff that's most strongly linked with cardiovascular disease. The larger particles are still important. Those are things that are in pollen and dust. And then there's the gases, there's the nitrogen dioxide, ozone, and sulfur dioxide, as well as carbon monoxide that can contribute to different disease states. So the mechanism of action of this is really kind of interesting because it hits through three different pathways. There's your inflammatory response. So once the irritant gets into the system, there we go. It causes a cascade of different pathogens to be irritating. It can cause the blood vessels to constrict. It can cause some irritation in the endothelial linings, and you can cause a lot of different variabilities in terms of blood pressures. You can also have this neuroendocrine dysfunction, which activates stress hormones. So those things can raise your blood pressure and your heart rate and can contribute to different arrhythmias. And then there's this interesting pathway, the pollutant translocation, where your body actually absorbs some of these chemicals directly, and it induces a vascular injury. So just hearkening back, we know that the PM 2.5 are very, very damaging, but the way that they come into the system is very unique. And so we see that there are the normal pathways that we're familiar with where this is lung tissue taking in the particulate matter compounds, and it goes across the membranes into the capillaries through inflammatory markers. That's a little bit more of what we're used to. But the understanding that a particle could perhaps get through the lining of the lung into the capillary directly is this translocation pathway, and it's somewhat unique, and we have seen it, this is on a microscopic view to look at the particulate matter just going right into the blood vessels in the capillaries directly, so it can cause that immediate interaction in the body. Well, this process is something that we know in cardiovascular disease because this is what we see with atherosclerosis. You have particulate matter come in, the body starts to see it deposit within the blood vessel. Over time, you form a much more substantial narrowing or blockage within the artery. And then these other inflammatory agents come along and over time can cause disruption and can cause that fibrous cap to break off, and that is where we see heart attacks. So if we just shift our attention to some tissue damage, not just on a cellular level, but actually within the tissue, you can see that this is filtered air is right here, and the tissue is much more uniform. It looks to be more healthy tissue, but as you start to have dirtier air along the way, you see deposits of amyloid plaque, macrophages, and other damaging elements to the tissue. So you start to disrupt the internal membranes of the tissue, and that's also where there is a lot of dysfunction and irritation. And if we just go back a little bit more in terms of macro level, this was an interesting research study looking at coronary calcium deposits within your heart arteries that are from different levels of PM 2.5 within 6 different cities. This is the PM 2.5. This is Los Angeles. I know it's like microscopic for you all, but there is a red amount of PM2 in Los Angeles, and this is the nitrogen dioxide, a bit more in New York City than Los Angeles, but still quite a bit of red. And those populations that have these high levels of PM 2.5 and the nitrogen dioxide have higher amounts of deposits in their patient's coronary calcium than those that don't have that. So we've got to put this all together. We've got cellular mechanisms that are disruptive. We've got tissue mechanisms that are damaging. We've got coronary plaque. Well, how does this all come together so that we can understand what does the air pollution do to our bodies? So this is a research study looking at patients in Canada over the course of 10 years, and it looked at whether air pollution and hospitalizations for cardiovascular disease. And it showed that in circumstances where the PM 2.5 and the nitrogen dioxide levels were, again, very high, those correlated with acute cardiac hospitalizations. They saw this most significantly in elderly patients as well as women, particularly in the extremes of temperature, very, very cold or very, very hot. There's also some gender differences seen, and this was a short-term exposure. So these are people that were just hit with some sort of like acute event that caused air pollution in the area. It looks at ozone, nitrogen dioxide, as well as the PM 2.5. And it showed that women did have higher risks of not only cardiovascular death, but they also had higher risks of stroke associated with ozone. And then just to look at kids, I thought this was somewhat provocative because it looked at that plumping of the innermost lining of kids' carotid arteries. So kids that were 7 to 15-year-olds should not have plaquing noted in their carotid arteries. But within this study in Ecuador, looking at these kids that were exposed to traffic exposure, they did have increased plumping of that innermost lining. In Taiwan, a similar study looking at 12 to 30-year-olds after they had these similar exposures had a plumping of that innermost lining. So we can see that even with kids that have a lot of these mechanisms within their body to cause protection, we're still having damage to their arteries. There was one study looking at prenatal exposures. So for pregnant women that were exposed to high levels of ozone, they also had plumping of their kids, their unborn children's IMT, and they felt that that was somewhat related to DNA methylation, which we talked about a little bit last year. So this is a study that we're going to get into a little bit later because we have one of the authors of this study, but this is from Dr. Tan out of Cedars-Sinai. He examined the hospitalizations for patients out of the wildfires from LA last year. And you could see, perhaps not surprisingly, that for respiratory infections, there was a spike in the ER visits and hospitalizations after the wildfires. There was a spike in heart attacks after the wildfires. But interestingly, this study showed that there were all these chemistry abnormalities within the blood. And so we'll talk about what that actually means for patients that are exposed to the wildfires. Is it a more systemic response? Are there other multi-system disorders occurring? So that's going to be something that we talk about a little bit more later. So this seems like a disaster. Like, how do we fix this? This is not looking great. Well, we want to show that there are things that you can do about it. And so, in an effort to try to stay safe, we know that there are certain apps that you can look at that will give you a better understanding of what your air quality is. So this is one, there are a lot, so I'm not advertising this one, but that you can look up your city by city and or zip code, and it'll give you a score. And it'll tell you where your risk of is associated with that. And it also will give you a map of what things look like in your area. And then it gives the pollutants. So if you're worried about what your PM 2.5 is, or what your ozone levels are in the area, it'll also give you a little bit of a prompt to say, well, maybe this is a day where if you're somebody at risk, you should not be outside as much, or wear a mask if it's something that you're an at-risk patient. HEPA filters. So these are the high efficiency particulate air filters. These remove about 99% of all these very small particles. So having them nearby you, either at work or in your home, is going to be extremely effective at removing all this particulate matter. And this study showed, it was looking at endpoints of blood pressure and heart rate variability, but it showed a very profound response to being able to get that particulate matter out of your air. Masks. We learned a lot about masks during COVID. And so we know that these are the fabric masks, which are good to block some, usually droplet protection, but surgical masks have an additional layer, and you can block some fine droplets. But if you really want to block the PM 2.5, some of the ozone, you're going to need the KN95, the N95, as well as respirators. So to be heart healthy, this is something that has been a central focus for everything that we've talked about for the past 13 years. There is no substitute for healthy living. To eat healthy, to exercise, those are going to be things that combat the effects of some of these deleterious effects of air pollution. So having regular checks with your doctor, seeing how much plaque burden you have, understanding, are you at risk for having hypertension? Those are some of the primary things that you can do to protect your heart. And it really does make a huge difference. There were some research studies in China looking at 13,000 patients that were of risk for cardiovascular disease, and it looked at these different risk factors: smoking, drinking, amount of sleep, what your BMI was, what your physical activity is, and as well as how do you cook your food with electricity versus coal. And if you had on the lower spectrum of any of these things, even if you changed them after being identified with a risk of cardiovascular disease, it correlated with reduction in cardiovascular events. So even just making some small changes can improve your cardiovascular health. And if you think that you are vulnerable, there are a million different ways that you can look at your vulnerability and to see what your life expectancy will be. And so I just was using this to highlight that on the coastal areas, you could see we have a lot of low vulnerability. So we're very healthy out here. And if you are right around Pacific Heart Institute, you will live for a very long time. So in conclusion, air pollution leads to premature cardiovascular disease in about 7 million people. Particulate matter, particularly the PM 2.5, is a major culprit leading to cardiovascular disease. Environmental toxins, including PM 2.5, lead to inflammatory response, a neuroendocrine response, and translocation. Women and children are affected more than our male counterparts, and when in an affected area, N95 masks as well as HEPA filters can help filter dangerous particulate matter, and having a heart-healthy lifestyle can combat the effects of air pollution. All right. Dr. Scheffler's talk is next.
Thank you for a great talk, Dr. Weinberg. All right, so I'm going to be speaking about water. So this is a map that looks at water scores from different countries. So scores of sanitation and clean water. So the darker colors have higher scores, and the lighter colors have lower scores. So you can see a vast majority of our planet actually needs safer water. So 2.2 billion people lack access to safely managed water. 3.4 billion lack safely managed sanitation, which is what impacts water the vast majority of the time. And 1.7 billion lack basic hygiene services just at home. So the UN has come up with 17 sustainable development goals. Clean water is one of those, number 6. But you can see that from listening to our prior talks, many other goals directly impact whether you're going to have clean water. So poverty, good health and well-being, quality education, affordable energy, your infrastructure, sustainable energy, responsible consumption, et cetera, et cetera. And many deaths are related to chemical pollution, as we've heard. Air pollution is key. Water pollution's right after that. Bottom right, you can actually see how many deaths are attributed to water pollution. So in Angola, India, Kenya, Ghana, Indonesia, these areas have a lot of water pollution impacting morbidity and also mortality. So toxins in water. I'm charged with talking about these 3 toxins, which I actually knew nothing about. I was like, why can't I talk about cholesterol or blood pressure or valve disease or heart failure? But I'm actually grateful that I learned about this. So first we're going to talk about PFAS. So this is going back to one of my favorite organic chemistry classes. They're per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, sometimes known as forever chemicals. So there are 5,000 different PFAS, and they're basically a carbon or alkyl backbone surrounded by fluorine atoms. How can I be exposed? This is what we're all wondering when we come to this talk. Like, where am I going to get the PFAS from? So various foods, so marine kind of animals that are exposed to PFAS, or food packaging, when you think about the grease liner in your food packaging that you're getting or to-go box, in your drinking water. So typical water treatment doesn't necessarily remove PFAS, but some home filters can remove it. And then dust exposure. So some of the carpets or textiles in your home may be shedding some PFAS that you're ingesting really, really small amounts or inhaling small amounts. So what are the products? Here are several different products. There's clothing and textiles, carpeting and flooring, nonstick cookware. The water-resistant clothing that you wear may have PFAS. So a lot of different areas may actually be exposing you unknowingly. So you can actually look up where PFAS contamination is really important in your neighborhood. So the light blue is drinking water above the proposed limit for PFAS, and then the dark blue is drinking water below the proposed limit. So you can type in your address. I typed in Pacific Heart. We will live forever at Pacific Heart if we get a water filter, I think, because our drinking water is apparently slightly above the proposed limit, interestingly. But this is, again, from 2025, so hopefully we are now in better shape. And there are many different organic pollutants out there. One of them is PFAS, and one of the various mechanisms that can lead to coronary disease, peripheral arterial disease, are things like oxidative stress, systemic inflammation, and endocrine disruption. You can see our distinguished speaker, Dr. Rajagopalan, is one of the authors of this. So I've borrowed several figures from some of his papers for this talk. And human studies suggest that we can be exposed to PFAS, and it can actually affect many different organ systems, the thyroid, fertility in women, lower infant birth weight, et cetera, et cetera. One proposed mechanism is by altering the way platelets function and can increase arterial thrombosis, and the way that we're responding to these can, over time, kind of gradual insults, increase our risk for atherosclerosis as well. So moving to microplastics, we already heard there's not a completely agreed upon scientific definition, but essentially it's a plastic particle less than 5 millimeters. There's even nanoparticles less than 1 micron or 1 micrometer. And how do they get into your water? So wastewater is one way. It can also get in through sewer overflows, atmospheric deposition, surface runoff, even plastic waste, and maybe your plastic bottles and caps. This is an interesting study looking at BPA exposed mice, and they actually saw that they were developing lipids, kind of the fat accumulation in their liver. And that altered lipid metabolism, the way that the lipids were working, glucose homeostasis, how they process glucose, and over time increased obesity in those mice. So how do the risks from microplastics stack up against other risks? So microbial pathogens are actually a really important risk factor for water pollution. About 500,000 diarrheal deaths were attributed to microbial pathogens, so fecally contaminated water. And you might say, you know what, that doesn't really apply to us here in the US, and we're just focusing on ourselves here, but actually 15% of the US, or 43 million people, rely on private wells. And within these private wells, including areas of California, have microorganisms. So Campylobacter, Shigella, Yersinia, E. coli, et cetera, which can lead to norovirus, rotavirus, a lot of these diarrheal illnesses, among other chemicals. So some of the other chemicals can be metals, pesticides, et cetera. So moving on then, I'm gonna go to metals now. So we heard about arsenic, lead, and cadmium. This is also from a paper that Dr. Rajagopalan wrote about environmental pollution and cardiovascular disease. So you see these are some of the different metallic pollutants. And then over time, you can inhale them, ingest them, kind of many different ways that you can take them in. And then they can lead to these processes we've been talking about, like systemic inflammation, disruption of the lining of your blood vessels, and then lead to things like apoptosis, which is cell death, and then finally can affect these outcomes. So if you see the red, yellow, and green, that's cardiovascular disease, coronary disease, and stroke. And then 1 is kind of the reference here on relative risk, and whenever you see that bar going to the right, that increases your risk. So you can see how risk is going up in every single one of those areas almost with exposure to various metals. And then this shows you that really it's many different mechanisms working in parallel. So it's things like the alteration in lipid metabolism I talked about, but also oxidative stress, cell damage, kind of all working in concert. And then finally, this is another interesting slide showing that you could have multiple exposures. So you can be exposed to lead and metals, but also to pesticides. And these different pathways are quite complex, but working together to ultimately disrupt the regulatory systems that your body relies on. So here is a slide kind of showing over time all these different exposures and initiating mechanisms, pathways that then lead to plaque, and then ultimately, heart attack, stroke, etc. Interestingly, some of these metallic pollutants disproportionately affect women. This is something I didn't have an appreciation of, but during certain times in a woman's life, there is more lead in the bloodstream. So we talked about how the bone is a main repository for lead. And so during menopause and in pregnancy, there's more bone resorption and metabolism. So if women are exposed to additional lead in their environment during those times, they're actually at very increased risk for high blood pressure, and even for preeclampsia, which is a very important cause of maternal mortality in our country. So when you're looking at, we always talk about risk assessment here and bringing it back to the topics I'm very comfortable with, like hypertension and cholesterol. So when I'm talking to people about their risk factors, I'm looking at those traditional risk factors, as well as in the middle column, the pregnancy-related risk factors like preeclampsia, gestational hypertension, diabetes. and then other female-specific factors, and then incorporating now environmental toxins. And so really, if you think about it, these pollutants can affect every organ system. They can go from head to toe, essentially your skin, your intestine, your lungs, and so on and so forth. So we know there are many harmful exposures like air pollution, noise pollution is another one, climate change, chemical pollution. Their pathways overlap and then can lead to issues as a result. So what can you do about it? It's not all doom and gloom. So we can test our water at home. If you think you might be living in a home that was built before 1986, for example, you might have lead piping, and that might be leaching into your water supply. So you might want to get it tested. Definitely, if you rely on a private well, you might want to get that water tested. So there are a lot of different situations where it might be helpful to look at your own water supply. And this is something I found on the EPA website that you can access. Other personal strategies: limit pesticide use, PFAS, limit dietary metals, potentially filter your water, increase your fruit and vegetable intake. This was an interesting study of 13,000 women that actually higher magnesium concentration in drinking water was protective in a dose-dependent way. So for myocardial infarction, ischemic stroke, and hemorrhagic stroke, as the concentration of magnesium went up, the incidence of these went down, which I thought was pretty interesting. Also, diets rich in vegetables, fruit, fish, and white meat can attenuate cardiovascular effects of metals in water, also in a kind of dose-dependent way. It's hard to see, but at the bottom of these, it shows you occasionally, frequently, and almost every day for consumption of these different things. And actually, the risk that these different metals posed went down for heart failure, cardiovascular disease, and stroke, the more vegetables, fruit, fish, and white meat that you incorporated into your diet. Finally, these are different ways you can filter your water. So you can use reverse osmosis, UV light, there's distillation and ozone methods. At home, you could use a countertop filter, an under the sink water filter. There's ways to disinfect water with chlorine. And then the other thing that's interesting is just thinking about your community. So if you're going to be going swimming in the water or surfing in the ocean within the last 3 days after a storm or rain, maybe not a great idea. This Surf for Health study out of UC Berkeley School of Public Health showed an increase by almost 3 times in GI illnesses, people going in the water after a rainstorm, for example. And that's something that looked at about 10,000 surfing events, and out of those, people had many more events of GI illnesses. This was an interesting study out of the Strong Heart study that we heard about earlier today, looking at ways that you can harness resources as a community. So facilitators went around and helped people in their homes actually install these arsenic removal devices, and people had great kind of outcomes after that. And then it really shows you that it's not just an individual, but it's at the facilitator level, and it's the whole community thinking about obstacles and trying to impact positive change. So that really takes us to the public health kind of and policy intervention. So we need to be doing many different things. We have to look at water infrastructure, protect our water kind of sources, strengthen monitoring, eliminate lead service lines, control emissions, and really kind of increase funding so that we can get this done. And so really it's governmental interventions as well as personal interventions that will create positive change ultimately. And so if we can kind of add the urban spatial planning to our supply side innovations like green energy, kind of using more electric, et cetera, then reduce our own exposures, which will then decrease the number of times you're getting these intermediary pathways that are damaging. Ultimately, we'll have fewer adverse cardiometabolic outcomes. And so this was actually an interesting video game I learned about called City Skylines, where if you're able to design your own city. I don't know if anybody's played this game before. Yeah, we have a few people. Okay. So you actually, it depends on, so you plan out your city, and if you put things like a water source next to an industrial plant or a sewage plant, your city is not going to prosper. So I thought it was pretty interesting that we're introducing this concept of how we lay out our cities really impacts like the kind of water supply you're going to have long term. And so in conclusion, 2.2 billion people lack access to safely managed drinking water. PFAS, microplastics, and metals are contaminants we know can down the line impact cardiovascular disease risk. Mechanisms are inflammation, oxidation, dysregulation, epigenetic changes, and we can make interventions at a personal level, a community, and a government level. That's it. Thank you.
Welcome back, everybody. We're going to continue our discussions here. So I'm thrilled to introduce and welcome our next special guest from the Pacific Heart family, Dr. Rigvig Tadwalker and Dr. Serena Vanderzee, who are going to be diving into the world of food and plastics and the best heart-healthy consumer as relates to everyday toxins we come across. Welcome.
I know it's always tough coming back from that initial break, so thank you for rejoining us here. So we're going to jump into talking about diet because it's a major exposure source. So we'll spend some time discussing this. Of course, we got this very amazing high-level overview with Dr. Rajagopalan. And I do also want to briefly, before I get started, thank Dr. Weinberg for again putting on a fantastic conference. We should all give her a big round of applause. And also for the invitation here to speak and to be a part of it. So this is kind of funny because we kind of all know what food is. What is food though really, right? So we think of it in the sense of sugar and salt and fat and calories, and we think about this all the time, right? If you're somewhat conscious about what you're putting into your body, you're thinking about this all the time. But we don't think about it as a daily environmental exposure. And that's important to remember. That's really the key as to why we need to shift our attention, not just cardiometabolic, but environmental exposure as well. And what we buy and ingest often leads to invisible as well as cumulative exposure over decades and a lifetime. So just to speak to the initial part, obviously cardiometabolic signals are linked to food exposure specifically. We have known associations with dyslipidemia, insulin resistance, hypertension, even systemic inflammation. This is where things like the anti-inflammatory diet come in, and that is the basis behind that. But you heard a lot about the exposome today and how the exposome relates to daily life, how environmental exposure shape cardiovascular risk over time. This is a fantastic diagram from one of Dr. Rajagopalan's papers, looking at all these complex mechanisms and how they interact. And food is one of the most frequent exposure pathways. Let's talk about a few of these pathways without really drowning into mechanistic details. So we have the inflammatory pathway. This is innate immune signaling. We can lead to pro-inflammatory cytokines as well as inflammation. Oxidative stress and endothelial dysfunction as well, which can impair vascular reactivity, can cause plaque formation. And then, of course, we have this pathway that is metabolic and neurohormonal, can lead to stress and insulin-related pathways, which can then amplify cardiometabolic risk. So you can see how this can be problematic. Now, importantly, today, what I'm talking about is food exposure, not necessarily food preparation. And in fact, we're talking about everything that happens upstream before food gets to your home. So this includes the processing and packaging, but also the environmental contamination that occurs in the process. So later, my colleague, Dr. Vanderzee, is going to discuss storage and preparation and how that's different. So think about this as everything before it gets to your kitchen. Now, why do food-related exposures matter for heart health? Well, we know that the cardiovascular system is exquisitely sensitive to pathways of inflammation, metabolic disruption, endothelial injury, and many food-related exposures have shared pathways, and this is incremental increase in risk that can be especially problematic for vulnerable populations as well. And microplastics, in fact, are in the food supply. They're detected in seafood, like our marine animals, because of the high plastic concentration. Table salt because of environmental contaminants. Bottled water for obvious reasons is packaged in plastic. And fruits and vegetables in many cases because of how they may be farmed or because of how they may be farmed. And diet is if not the major exposure route, probably aside from drinking water. And other potential exposure routes include inhalation of airborne microplastics, dermal contact with consumer products as well. Now, in this figure to the left, you'll actually see this is from the World Health Organization of global plastic production over time since 1950. And you can see that as the decades go onward, we see this steep, almost logarithmic style curve. And you can see how problematic this is becoming. So this is really timely for us to discuss now, but in reality, we probably should have been discussing this even 10 years ago. So this is increasingly going to become a part of cardiovascular risk assessment and part of cardiology as we continue to practice as healthcare professionals. Now, you heard a few references to this paper, so I won't go into great depth, but this is this landmark New England Journal paper from 2024 that showed evidence of micro and nanoplastics detected in carotid artery plaques. So these were detected in 58% of carotid plaques analyzed over a median follow-up of just under 3 years. And the presence of these is associated with a 4.5 times higher risk of composite outcome of myocardial infarction, stroke, death. So this is the first human study to link microplastics directly to some form of cardiovascular outcome. Now, this is a really great time for us to pause and think about just traditional scientific principles, because this is a wonderful microcosm for understanding these concepts about association and causation, right? We're seeing associations. We haven't had that causality just yet. And what's sort of unclear is really still where more research needs to be done are the exposure sources, the dosing thresholds, the timing. This isn't fully defined. So these are hypothesis generating, but importantly, biologic plausibility does exist, right? So even though we are talking about associations, we are now seeing how the science suggests biologic plausibility that there could potentially be causality, and that's important to note. So beyond plastics, what other exposures should we be concerned of? You heard about these a little earlier too, but there are food-related chemical exposures like PFAS and bisphenols, which can enter food via packaging, processing, and agricultural contamination. So these are sort of these grease-resistant packages, your fast food wrappers, like the parts of canned goods as well. The food processing itself, all of those things contribute to this. And these compounds not only persist, but they also accumulate. So think about that in terms of a long-term exposure. And epidemiologic studies do in fact link higher exposure to that risk. I wanted to take a quick aside to talk a little bit about pesticides. And we always talk about organic food versus conventional or non-organic food, or however you'd like to say it. And while it's true that organic foods generally have lower pesticide residues, they are not pesticide-free. There's basically certain methods that are less sort of pesticide-heavy, but they can be pesticides that are involved in organic farming. So for example, in organic farming, you can actually use these copper-based fungicides. So actually, organic food can still have high metal content. So it doesn't really say much about the metal content. So this is really an important thing to remember. Another thing that I love telling my patients, which they hate to hear, is that organic junk food is the same as regular junk food. Just because it says junk food, or just because it says organic on the label doesn't mean that it can't be junk food. So please be careful about what you're eating as a snack. Now, not all foods carry the same exposure burden, and some conventional foods contribute disproportionately to pesticide exposure. I'm actually going to jump into something that you might have seen or at least heard about in recent years. And this is where it becomes important. Practical prioritization is really what makes a difference over perfection. We are not trying to be perfect. No one's going to remember all these different aspects of farming or the way that your food is prepared, but we have to try to do our best to be reasonable consumers. So this is actually from the Environmental Working Group. You can actually find this online. It's a shopper's guide that they publish annually. And this one's for 2025, talking about the Clean 15 and also the Dirty Dozen. So the Clean 15, these are the foods that happen to, in this past year, be sort of the least pesticide heavy. And you can see some of these on the list: pineapples, sweet corn, papaya, avocado, onion, so on and so forth. So these are ones where you may want to consider even purchasing them as conventional items as opposed to getting them organic. Whereas the dirty dozen, which people tend to focus on more, are the ones that are more pesticide heavy. So these include potatoes, blueberries, blackberries, apples, pears. Again, this is not to say that these fruits are not nutritious or vegetables are not nutritious. It's basically to say that these are pesticide heavy. So you may want to consider buying organic and being a little bit more thoughtful about the source of where they are coming from. Also, if you live in California, you may have seen this label, Proposition 65. If you're a consumer that's kind of going around these businesses looking at labels, you may see this Prop 65 label. And what California Proposition 65 is sort of requires disclosure of certain chemicals and exposures. These warnings reflect potential exposures. They are not proven harm, and that's important to remember. Online retail packaging and transparency can vary widely in these situations, so these labels can be used as a screening tool, not necessarily a verdict. Now, let me give you like a little bit more of a tangible explanation of this. So there's things when you see Prop 65 where you want to be maybe a little bit less concerned, and those where you kind of want to pause and think. The ones where you're a little bit less concerned are things that are kind of like single use. It's like, the packaging that something comes in, you may only come into contact with it once. And while single-use plastics for environmental reasons can also be problematic, from a personal exposure standpoint, that initial pass-through is sort of maybe something where you don't have to worry about the Prop 65 portion of it, about that initial exposure, because it's not a consistent exposure to you personally at that moment. Whereas on the other hand, things like food and beverage, right? We're putting that into our body, right? So that's something you have to be concerned about. Or heating items, especially if they come in plastic containers, you want to be very cautious with. And this comes up for a lot of us because a lot of us get takeout food. And even if that takeout food is healthy, they can come in those plastic containers. So you want to be cautious with the reheating aspect, put it in, a ceramic or glass dish and then reheat. So things of that nature. So when you see Prop 65, it's not to say like, go run away. You just want to be cautious about why that label is there. And then that way you can make an informed decision about what you want to do. Now, I found this quite interesting, just going into the literature. This is actually a 2020 study. It's a basic science paper in physiological research looking at GLP-1 biology and environmental exposure and looking for a mechanistic signal. We often think about, okay, well, in fact, throughout the day today, we've talked about these different environmental exposures and what they can do to the human body. So then the question becomes, well, how do we combat this beyond just usual lifestyle measures, as we like to say? And while there's a lot there, we often think about the pharmacotherapeutic aspect as well. But the idea is this, is that environmental chemicals like phthalates, DEHP, promote pro-atherogenic vascular changes. Now, in this study, in these in vitro cellular models, they found that GLP-1 receptor agonism actually attenuated these effects on human vascular smooth muscle cells. So this suggests that there is a mechanistic metabolic and incretin pathways that might intersect with these toxin-mediated vascular injuries. So this is, in fact, hypothesis generating, of course, but it is of interest because now we can add to the armamentarium of pharmacotherapeutic strategies to mitigate cardiovascular risk. We already know about statins and inflammatory reduction. We know about ACEs and ARBs and how they can affect vasoreactivity, and even metformin, which can affect insulin sensitivity and inflammation as well. So this looks at the fact that, yes, environmental toxin-mediated damage might in fact be mitigated to some degree by drugs that we already have available and are using. So of course, this is a women's heart conference. Why is this a women's heart health issue? Because we could be talking about anybody right now. But it's because hormonal signaling interacts with many exposures that involve a woman's life cycle. Pregnancy, midlife, menopause, these are vulnerable windows. Heightened metabolic and vascular sensitivity during these windows. You've already heard a little bit about this. So this is particularly unique for women and makes it that much more important. And these cardiometabolic effects compound over the traditional risk factors that all of us are exposed to and that we discuss all the time. This is quite interesting as well. This is actually a food map. You can actually go to this USDA page to look at food maps, to look for where there are food deserts. these are places where there's limited access to healthy food and instead a reliance on ultra-processed food. So I actually pulled up a map of greater Los Angeles and beyond to take a look at this, and you can see how that within our own communities, there are significant disparities. And if there has in fact been a theme throughout today, looking at maps, you can see significant disparities side by side. So you can actually go to this site and toggle a number of different options to determine how far you or someone you know might be from having access to appropriate foods. So this goes to say that access is in fact structural in a lot of instances and not individual. Now, what's fantastic is that a lot of what we can do to combat environmental effects does involve personal agency, right? Our ability to go out there and exercise and trying to sleep and things of that nature. But there's clearly a structural issue that needs to be overcome. And we don't want to forget about this, which is why it's so important that we're working on the policy level and not just the individual level to combat these issues. Now, of course, as physicians, what are we being asked? Right? A lot of patients come to us about these issues. Is this real? Is this something I should avoid, right? We're talking about a specific, environmental chemical or a specific exposure. What's evidence-based versus hype? And so to the clinicians in the audience, my advice is that we don't want to promote a fear-based narrative, because the truth is that you could rack your brain over this all day about all the environmental exposures you had over the course of the day, the year, the last 10 years, maybe an apartment that you lived in for a few years, right? This can go on and on, but we do want to instead focus on the evidence-based aspect of it, and of course, what we can do and those practical strategies. So from a food perspective, what in fact are those practical strategies that we can lean on? Well, of course, we want to favor whole and minimally processed food. We want to reduce reliance on ultra-processed food. These are things you hear about all the time. But we also want to focus on cumulative risk reduction related to the environmental aspect. So what does that mean, like when you're shopping in a grocery store, for example? You want to go for the loose produce instead of that pre-packaged plastic container fruit, perhaps, or the plain grains versus the packaged grains. Or you have to do something what I call shopping the perimeter, right? You want to go for all the loose items, not the stuff that's packaged in the middle in the aisles. So this is a really easy way when you're walking into a supermarket to try to figure out, okay, well, what is my strategy going to be to make sure that I'm doing the best that I can in terms of food exposures? What is this not? Now, many of you who know me or have seen me as patients know I do a lot of social media online. I'm very clear when I talk about things of this nature that this is not detox advice, right? Like we're not saying like, hey, do X, Y, and Z or drink, A, B, and C in order to sort of clear yourself of toxins, right? That's not a thing, right? So it's really important that we make that clear. This is not food elimination, like stop eating, this specific food or these sets of foods. That is also deleterious. It's about choosing the right types of foods, right types of fats, right types of proteins, things of that nature. We don't want to forget about it. And it's not a replacement for standard prevention. So on the other end, even if you're doing everything you can to mitigate your environmental exposure, you also don't want to forget about the cardiometabolic aspect, right? And sort of how you're proportioning your plate and things like that. So this is additive awareness. It's not replacement advice. So in summary, I just want to put this all together. Food is in fact a meaningful exposure pathway beyond cardiometabolic risk. There's emerging evidence that it links to cardiovascular risk specifically, and I think we will see in time there will be more and more of this. In fact, so much so that I think that it will likely become, in some aspects, part of our cardiology curriculum to discuss these things in greater depth, even at the resident and fellow level. And that balance and practical guidance is key, not just for the consumer or patient, but even for us as healthcare professionals and how we are approaching this topic with the public as well. And finally, even small changes may reduce long-term risk. Thank you. And then just briefly, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Van der Zee, who's going to pick up on everything that happens after the grocery store, okay? So, so listen up.
Good morning. I'm here to tell you how to become a more mindful consumer, what products and practices you can adopt to minimize your exposure to microplastics. We've heard this morning about where microplastics come from. Where do they go? Well, 12 billion pounds of plastics are dumped into the ocean each year. And when you look at the composition of that plastic, the majority by number of pieces and 10% of the total mass are microplastics. But the real reason that we care about talking about this today is where they end up in our bodies through inhalation, ingestion, and dermal exposure. These microplastics end up in every part of the body. Every organ that's ever been studied has demonstrated evidence of microplastics. They cross the blood-brain barrier, the blood follicular barrier, the blood testes barrier, and get into every organ. From a cardiovascular perspective, this includes our carotid arteries, as we've seen, thrombi, the heart tissue, and we've seen today the specific mechanisms by which these can potentially act. To put this in context, microplastics clearly contribute to vascular inflammation. The evidence for this is less well established than for PM 2.5 and for heavy metals, but still very important, largely falling into the known unknown category that we heard about earlier today. But as with food, you can choose products and practices at home that reduce your exposure. And again, as with food, being practical about this is more important than zero access, which is impossible. Let's start with clothing, linen, and towels, because as a proportion of exposure, this is actually the largest one. So synthetic fibers like polyester, nylon, and acrylic shed microplastics into the air and water through wear and laundering. There is actually also absorption into the skin, particularly for nanoplastics that are less than 1,000 nanometers. So what can you do? You can buy less of these synthetic items. You can choose natural fabrics instead, like cotton, bamboo, linen, hemp, silk, and wool. Consider also your wash. Wash less if you can. There is an attenuation of the shedding of microplastics over time. After approximately 5 washes, there's a bit of an equilibration that occurs. In addition, microfiber filters are available for your washing machine. These are on the more expensive side, $150 to $250, but on the lower end of the price range, you can buy certain laundry bags. Guppy Friend is one example of these that actually filter out the microplastics from your wash. Food preparation is a very important topic. The major principle here is that heat accelerates the leaching of plastics into food and promotes the oxidation of the plastic particles. Again, we heard about the processing of these, especially tiny particles, is problematic. So a very important principle is avoid heating food in plastic containers, especially in the microwave. The mechanism of plastic transfer from the microwave compared to stove and other heating technologies is significant. Beware the phrase microwave safe. All that means is it isn't going to melt in your microwave. It doesn't mean that it's not going to shed microplastics into your food. After researching this talk, I personally am not going to ever buy microwave popcorn again. There's something specific to the lining of containers that hold oily foods. So soup cans, microwave bags that are particularly rich in microplastics, and because you're heating those foods, they're particularly prone to shedding. The lining of nonstick pans can also leach microplastics into your food. So, as a principle, choose your vessel carefully. If you have the option for metal, glass, ceramic, or cast iron, choose that instead. Another term to be careful of is BPA-free. Now, BPA was banned from baby bottles in 2012, because it was clearly shown to be an endocrine disruptor that led to developmental harm in infants. However, we haven't had similar legislation for adults. The BPA leaches into liquids, particularly when heated. Again, heat being a very important principle of the transfer. But the reason that you need to be careful is that you can replace bisphenol A with bisphenol S, for example, or another similar compound that can cause similar endocrine disruptions. BPS may be more heat stable, but it also may be more potent. So be careful with your labels, but BPA-free is not a bad place to start. Disposable cups. This was very interesting to me. Disposable cups, whether they're made of plastic or whether they're paper cups, often have a lining of microplastics. That's to prevent leaks. The lids, of course, are often made of plastic as well. And as with food preparation at home, heat causes the lining to break down and leaching microplastics into the beverage. And this is a very significant effect. The order of magnitude can be more than 50-fold. So when you have a choice, choose a ceramic cup or a travel mug instead, especially for your coffee, tea, or other hot liquids. Turning to cosmetics and toiletries, certainly you want to avoid microbeads. These are small components that are found in the scrubs and washes. Now, even the US figured out we need to be careful of these, and they banned them from products made in the US, but they can still be found in imports. So certainly try to avoid a facial scrub with microbeads in it, and choose natural exfoliators like ground nutshell, salt, or sugar instead. Now, more common these days would be other products like lotions, creams, and makeup. And up to 16% of the products tested in some studies have found polymers in those compounds. So minimize those when you can. I would also caution you against a product that calls itself microplastic free, but at least it's a move in the right direction. And there are some alternatives out there. I actually tried these in preparation for the talk. There's tooth tablets that you can use instead of toothpaste that comes in plastic tubes. Actually it tastes great. I've actually converting, especially for travel, it's great. And then bar soap, bar shampoo, etc. A final word, thermal receipts often contain BPA. It's used as a color developer, so the receipts that are generated at the point of service in the machines in a lot of our stores contain BPA. Transfer is enhanced if you have hand sanitizer or if you have lotion on your hands. So when you have a choice, decline the receipt or choose an electronic version, and you might notice that some people who are handling these often or wear gloves, and nitrile has a better effect on the chemically than latex gloves. So my take-home messages to you are that as a consumer, you have simple, low-cost options for minimizing your exposure. This is especially important for the females in the audience because of the endocrine disrupting effects and because of the reproductive health implications. And even small changes can reduce your own personal cardiovascular risk, and as we'll get into more in the afternoon, elevate your global citizenship. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. So I'm Francesca Casalino. I am new to Pacific Heart, and this is my first Women's Health Symposium. Luckily, this isn't my first conference ever I've been to, so I understand that I stand between you and lunch, and I will try to make this brief. So you guys have already heard a lot about this, how all these environmental factors, pollutants, plastics, et cetera, interact with your cardiovascular health. I'm not going to belabor the point. And I think stepping back, I want to think about how your exposure really is dictated by where you are physically, who you are, and this has been a theme as well. But who you interact with, where you live, what your culture is, where you work, where you travel, is going to dictate what you put in your body, what you bring into your home, what you are exposed to. And so that's true whether you live in Santa Monica, South Central LA, Beijing, Dubai, anywhere in the world is going to dictate how you interact with these various exposures. So this is a map looking at sort of how excess mortality is affected by the PM 2.5 particles that we've heard so much about. And as you can see, while we're all exposed to varying levels of this, there's excess mortality in certain areas of the world. And a lot of that is dictated by, yes, the exposure that they have, but densely populated areas are more likely to be exposed and more affected. So looking at this map particularly, you see India, China, sort of Southeast Asia and Africa are more affected by these than, say, if we look over in America, where we're sort of white and we have less white on the map, and we have less excess mortality. And this is a map sort of giving you a reference point of how much exposure we have globally based on where you live. But focusing a little more on the United States, this, I think you guys will be sort of drawn to California, where we have some of the most particle concentration exposure. And this is all sort of in the Central Valley, the San Joaquin Valley, where we have a high amount of agriculture and oil production and house and industry there. And they actually, for the past 25 years, have been out of compliance with the EPA. And it's given the sort of unpopular term of sort of the worst environmental impact in the world, or at least in the country. So just something that I was not aware of. So, but that beyond the particle matter, we really need to think about your environmental burden is dictated by all the things we've talked about today. So your air pollution, but also how close you are to hazardous waste sites or toxic chemicals or factories, your built environment. So your green spaces, your traffic environment, your infrastructure, sort of how close you are to roadways and airports, and then water pollution. All these things can be put together into a sort of environmental burden index, and that's very specific based on where you live in the country. So this is a map that sort of shows you that. It shows you across in various communities, the various environmental burden, putting all these things together. And we can see that it's sort of targeted a lot in the Midwest, has a lot, which there's a lot of agriculture and industry there. And then also California has some of that as well. And it's also very urban areas. And so you can see this distribution. When we look in the study, when they looked at how that environmental burden interacts with cardiovascular health, something we've talked about already, but these areas where there's a higher environmental burden also have higher prevalence of cardiovascular disease, so hypertension, diabetes, obesity, coronary artery disease, and stroke risk. But interestingly, there's also in these areas, or maybe not so interestingly, not surprisingly, I guess, there's higher risks of poverty, people who are uninsured, racial and ethnic minorities are more concentrated in areas that have a higher environmental burden risk. And so this is a heat map looking at that poverty burden in our country and how that's distributed. And if you look at this next map, you might notice that there's which looks at sort of the adult coronary artery disease distribution. You might notice a sort of similar color pattern. Oh, how do I go back? There we go. Where, yes, where you live is very important, and it interacts very closely with your socioeconomic status and how that impacts your cardiovascular health, which is a complicated interaction. So Dr. Rajagopalan already talked about this social vulnerability index. This is not only your sort of socioeconomic status, but your racial and ethnic minority status, your household characteristics, how well you speak English in your house, your disability, And then your housing status, sort of where you live, quarters, apartment, a mobile home, and how that all these things can sort of be put together into an aggregate score to determine how vulnerable you are. And when we look at sort of your environmental burden, and then how that, and when you stratify your environmental burden and the association with cardiovascular disease, when we stratify based on your social vulnerability index, you can see the association between your environmental burden and your cardiovascular disease is a stronger association when you're more vulnerable. So that's these sort of top lines in each of these categories. You can see that there's a stronger association. And so this sort of highlights that while environmental burden impacts all of us, there's a great disparity based on your social vulnerability across our country. And when we look specifically, not only are those who are socially vulnerable and in having higher environmental burden, there's an association there. It's also found that in areas where there's a when people are more socially vulnerable, they're in areas of higher mental burden, and there's a distinction within those areas. So if you're in an area where there's a higher, where you're more socially vulnerable, you're more likely to be in an area where there's higher air pollution, and then there's higher proximity to toxic waste plants or factories. And this is from sort of many factors, as I'm sure we're aware, sort of systemic redlining and systemic racism that has put, and zoning that has put certain populations in areas that are allowed to live closer to sort of these facilities, where if we look at populations that are less socially vulnerable, their sort of environmental burden is is more associated with their built environment. So I think that this is sort of well established in this risk calculator. So this is something as cardiologists that we use to determine your sort of cardiovascular risk. It's looking at various traditional risk factors. As you can see, blood pressure, diabetes, hypertension, cholesterol. But interestingly, we also include your zip code, which is something we've already talked about is very important when determining your risk. So I wanted to focus more, sorry, I have so many maps. I wanted to focus more on Los Angeles, something that we all associate. What is sort of our environmental burden in Los Angeles, and how does that interplay? And so I think we're all pretty familiar that in LA we have bad traffic, and that impacts our pollution. And if you look closer, this sort of highlights LA County in the lower corner there, and you can see that our particle matter pollution is higher in this area as well. So I think when we look at the environmental burden of Los Angeles, think of air pollution, extreme temperatures, which is not something we've talked about as much today, and then our risk of wildfires. So it's not news to anyone that our hopefully not news to anyone that our planet is heating up, and this is sort of the projected increased heat in LA County specifically. You can see there's a variability based in where you live, but everywhere is expected to heat up by mid-century. And why is this important to cardiovascular health? So there's an interplay here where, high heats result in dehydration. Dehydration results in low blood volume, which results in decreased perfusion and damage to your various organs. If you're dehydrated and your blood pressure is low, then your heart can pump less blood out, and that results in your heart compensating by increasing its heart rate, increasing its contractility, which puts more strain on your heart. So overall, this sort of interplay is important to your cardiovascular health. This was a study done in a very densely populated province in China, where they looked at the interaction between extreme heat and particle exposure and how it impacts specifically myocardial infarction. So this is a case crossover study where each person is their own case and control. and they looked over and sort of compare over time, and they picked out people who passed away from myocardial infarctions. And in this population, in this study, they found that there was a significant interaction between the high heat events and that exposure to particle matter, and how those two things resulted in increased mortality for myocardial infarction. Interestingly, women, bringing in the heart health for women, were more vulnerable to these heat waves. And so this has been talked about already, but it's not surprising from what we've already learned about how particle matter increases your thrombogenicity, your atherosclerosis burden, and your inflammatory response, that if you're also dehydrated and in a high heat environment, that these two things can interact to increase your cardiovascular health. Looking specifically at LA, so this is a map that looks at excess emergency room visits over the course of a sort of heat wave as a sort of marker for how heat impacted health in the area. And you can see there was a large discrepancy within the LA County area, where areas that are traditionally more disadvantaged experienced higher levels of emergency room visits during this period of time, and really highlights the difference in your exposure to green space, your predisposing factors, and your maybe in your socioeconomic status. So finally, I wanted to touch a little bit on wildfires, as I think that that is globally an issue, but I think is something that a lot of us have been affected by in the Los Angeles area, and is unfortunately something that I think we all need to recognize is going to be something that we will continue to be affected by. This is a map that sort of projects the expected amount of wildfire burden that we're going to have by the mid-century. Most of it, as you can see, is sort of concentrated in the San Gabriel Mountains. There's expected to be, which is sort of a significant area, high-risk area, and it's expected to be a higher amount of wildfires in that area. And why is this important? So there's data that basically suggests that in sort of an acute wildfire setting, I've already talked to you some about this, there's higher risk of heart attack, stroke, arrhythmia or rhythm issues, high blood pressure that can cause an actual crisis or damage to your organs, or heart failure exacerbations. And then on a more long-term scale, which has already been talked about, there's higher risk of blood pressure or elevated blood pressure and atherosclerotic disease. Smoke from these wildfires can travel huge distances. So it's not just about living near a fire and sort of being exposed directly. It has a smoke in one area travels up to 300 miles. And so most people in California definitely over the past year were exposed to fires, and you can see all over the country, all over the world. But these impacts do affect people differently. If you think about those who are, for either their work requirement, et cetera, are required to work outside for economic reasons or social reasons, our sort of first responders are obviously the ones who were in the line. I think there was a lot of publicity about the lack of facial masks and protection that a lot of those workers had during the Palisades and Eaton fires. And so they have high exposure risk compared to people who are working in office buildings or who have the ability to leave the area if there is a wildfire. Furthermore, people who have pre-existing health conditions, which has already sort of been talked about, are at higher risk of having some sort of having worsening health effects from wildfire smoke. As sort of Dr. Rajagopalan's initial slide looking at the two cases, sort of your environment, your exposure, the one woman who lived in a low-income area, who didn't have air filtration, who had to keep her windows open, who maybe lived in a less secure home, those people are at higher risk when there's a wildfire exposure. And in those areas, usually older buildings that are not well maintained, landlords are less likely to make those improvements for those people. And those people probably don't have the resources to sort of mitigate those things by buying air filters or traveling to sort of get away from the fire exposure. So I want to pause because I know that most people in this room were affected by the fires last year. And I don't want to, and I know it's probably not easy to hear there's going to be more fires. They're going to be more severe, that this is going to be an ongoing issue. And I don't want to say, and I understand that there's a whole devastation that comes with the personal experience of going through that. And it's totally different from the environmental burden that we all experience. But I think we do need to acknowledge that this is real, this is going to continue to happen, and we need to figure out, I think the whole purpose of this conference is to talk about how we can work within the environment and the exposures that we have. Finally, I wanted to end on a slightly more positive note, which has already been touched about, but the importance of green space, which I think in LA and California, we have amazing green spaces to take advantage of. And you really got to think about this. There's sort of the larger green spaces, going camping, going to the mountains, getting out of our urban environment. Then there's the urban environment green spaces, parks that we have, going to the beach, we're so lucky that we can drive a few miles to get into the mountains and go for amazing hikes. And then personal green spaces. So your garden, your house plants, everything like that has some impact and improves things for you. There's tons of data that suggests that sort of how dense your population is, the traffic safety, your recreational activities are tightly linked to your physical activity levels, your BMI. Places that have higher density traffic are less walkable, have more incident coronary artery disease, and areas that are more walkable are associated with decreased levels of type 2 diabetes, and overall increased vegetation is protective for your cardiovascular health. So there's, and again, as has already been commented on, there are a lot of confounding factors here. Places that are greener are likely more wealthy, and some of the studies I looked at did sort of show that some of these effects are slightly attenuated when stratifying for that. But generally, living closer to a green space is associated with lower all-cause mortality and cardiovascular mortality. And this sort of highlights that in more detail. So I thought this was sort of interesting that looking at people who had heart attacks, there was they basically had less injury from their heart attack if they lived in a more green area. And then actually the degree of narrowing was lower. That sort of suggests that maybe being in a green space lowers your or exposure to green space basically lowers your subclinical coronary atherosclerosis. And why is this? I mean, I think some of it you guys can sort of already assume. The social effects, the going out with people, walking, the physical activity, the stress burden that releases, having a safe environment to do those activities is important. But plants filter air pollution. They produce oxygen. They block noise. They block noise and light, which are things that we didn't talk as much about. And then we know that there are these human effects that we have from this. It lowers your blood pressure, it lowers your BMI, it increases your improves your cardiovascular health, and through various multiple mechanisms. And so I think if I could leave you with one sort of positive thing before we all go eat, I think that we can't control everything. A lot of the things that we need to do to change this are higher policy level changes that need to be made. And I mean, we can advocate and we should do everything we can personally and for our community. There are ways that you can go out and plant trees in areas in the LA area that have less access to green spaces. But I think that, as has already been talked about, engaging in your environment, getting out there, not being afraid of the air pollution, but going and enjoying your green spaces, being active is one of the best things you can do for your cardiovascular health. There's data to support it. So I think with that, I'll stop, and I think we have some raffle, and then we can eat. Thank you so much.
Over the last year, we've worked with an amazing group of women under the leadership of Stacy Levine, inspired by the energy and ethos behind our last Heart and Soul retreat. The Sacred Women Collective became our first national partnership, which is focused on our shared message of heart-centered living. We worked together to create a special preview version of our 30-day Women's Heart Health Journal coming later this year, and it combines journaling and teaching about somatic breathing and movement and women's heart health. There's an appendix to give any woman the tools to help regulate their nervous system, learn and explore their heart space, and learn about some heart cardiovascular basics along the way. Stay tuned. We're going to make that a free 7-day journal available next week. And we're so excited to bring these next 2 segments focused on exploring local and global perspectives on toxic mitigation. As wildfires become a recurring reality across California and beyond, our community is facing urgent questions about how to protect their health during and after exposure. This panel focuses on translating emerging science into practical evidence-based guidance for individuals, clinicians, and policymakers navigating the complex health risks associated with wildfire, smoke, contaminated environments, and long-term recovery. We will explore real-world concerns from the effectiveness of masks and air filtration to risks related to lead, water contamination, and lingering toxins in homes and soil long after visible smoke has cleared. Our second panel explores toxins through a global lens, and the discussion will examine how environmental toxins interact with traditional risk factors, the mechanisms driving cardiovascular injury and inflammation, the challenges of defining safe exposure thresholds in a rapidly changing world. And panelists will also explore practical questions that patients and clinicians face daily, from product safety. So without further ado, it's our privilege to welcome our post-wildfire contamination panel, local perspectives panel, Dr. Ashraf El-Sayed, Dr. Zaldi Tan, and Have a Heart, Save a Heart's own Dr. Nicole Weinberg. Dr. El-Sayed is a board-certified pulmonologist who has been involved in many research protocols targeting post-fire intervention and toxic mediation, as well as starting a wildfire relief clinic at St. John's. Dr. Tan is a board-certified gerontologist who recently published a paper in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology titled Emergency Encounters During and After the Los Angeles Wildfires that has been making headlines nationwide. Panelists, please come to the stage.
Thank you so much. We have Dr. El-Sayed and we have Dr. Tan. Hello, how are you? I am here to just moderate. I'm not an expert here, but I thought we would talk about, so the format will be I'll start to ask questions, and then we will have somebody in the audience with a microphone that we'll start passing around. And so really we want the questions to be dictated by you and how the conversation goes through this, but I'm just going to start off. Dr. Tan, you had a very well-received, nationally well-received article that was published in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology recently. Would you mind going over kind of some of the interesting points of that? I did highlight a little bit as an overview some of the initial findings about the hospitalizations after the wildfires, but then there are some like interesting other tidbits that we were looking at with the different chemistries.
Yes. So what we were interested in is to look at the rates of hospitalization and the patterns of emergency room visits after the wildfires. So Cedars is about 18 miles from Altadena and about 10 miles from the Palisades. So it was kind of in the area where we get some patients from both fire areas. So we were interested in looking at the hospitalizations from January 7th to April 7th, so that 90-day period during and after the wildfires, and comparing it to a 4-year period before the fires, so 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021, and then also looking at the, of course, taking into consideration COVID and other factors. So the interesting thing there is that when we look at emergency room visits in our emergency room, we found that there was, the number of visits were similar. So it's not like, a lot more people showed up in the emergency room. But the interesting thing is that the number of people who showed up for lower respiratory symptoms, cardiovascular, AMI, ACS, were quite a bit higher compared to to the patients who showed up before. So to us, this is really telling, right? That the acute effects of the wildfires are really showing up in how many people are getting sick and getting into the emergency room. So of course we did not look at it mechanistically, but others have. And really, what's been shown is that wildfire exposure doesn't only have long-term effects, but also acute effects, which I'm happy to talk about also in the future.
And Dr. Elsai, you have a wildfire relief clinic that you opened and were on the news about when the wildfires were going on. Can you talk about some of the things that you saw in clinic and also some of the things that we should be looking for in terms of keeping ourselves healthy and moving forward from your experiences with the wildfire clinic?
Yes, thank you. So at St. John's, we did start a wildfire relief clinic, and similar to Cedars, we had a lot of patients from the Santa Monica Palisades area, the Malibu area, but I had quite a few patients come in from the Altadena area as well. And we saw very similar. So patients that have underlying lung or heart disease were the most affected. They would come into the clinic with exacerbations of either asthma or COPD or any cardiac issues that they have. So we saw that almost immediately post-fire, whether they went to the ER or urgent care, and then they came to us to follow up with us. It's been a year out now from the fires. We're still seeing some long-term or longer-term issues with cough, with ongoing shortness of breath. And then part of the clinic we treat first responders. So the firefighters, the LAPD and CHP that were all deployed to the three areas, Malibu, Palisades, and Altadena. We're still seeing effects with them, and I'm still seeing quite a few patients with them.
I'm sure there are the acute effects that you see, then there's the subacute, and then there's the long-term effects. Could you kind of stratify out for us what maybe some of the differences or some of the things that, I'm sure some people are moving back to their homes, so then there's maybe different things that come up, or some people, the seasons change and then people are outside, or the rains come and then there's different things that kind of crop up.
So this is a crazy time. So, first of all, it's a massive fire. It's the largest urban fire in the history of the United States. But at the same time, there's a big wildfire component. So the wildfire component is where we saw a lot of the immediate problems. Patients that will come in with exacerbations, as I mentioned, patients that have, very high allergies will come in with problems with that, patients that have asthma, a lot of patients that have asthma, children to, the elderly. That was probably the biggest number of patients that we have. As time goes on and these exacerbations are treated and the patients feel better, the problem now is a little bit different. So it's not so much the smoke that they initially inhaled or the fires that were burning. It's more of what we call the VOCs, the volatile organic compounds that are left over after the urban part, after the homes burn down, after the cars burn down. The best example that we have of that, at least in the United States, is the World Trade Center. Although it's a smaller square footage, it was a big building, very tall buildings. So what we see from that event is the best that we have to compare it to. And I can tell you that with the World Trade Center, about 25% of the first responders and 25% of the victims are still receiving care now, almost 30 years later. So I'm predicting that we will see that again. The good thing about, if there is a good thing about the fires that we had, is a lot of people were able to evacuate, and a lot of people were able to move. With the World Trade Center, unfortunately, if you lived in Manhattan, you're kind of stuck in Manhattan, no matter what. So I think a lot more people maybe would have been exposed there than they are now, but we're still going to see some long-term effect. And the long-term effects are, depending on how in-depth we want to go, it's really in response to these organic compounds, lead, asbestos, hydrogen fluoride, hydrogen cyanide. There's a whole list, fluoride, lithium. So there's a whole list of these organic compounds that became airborne and ended up in the soil, ended up in the ash that we still see. And those have the potential of causing long-term damage, long-term pulmonary damage, cardiovascular damage, pulmonary fibrosis, lung cancer are the biggest issues that we have to worry about. And of course, with lead has its own set of problems with neurologic problems, pregnant women, breastfeeding women, children returning to the schools. So it's not the best of scenarios right now. Now, again, some of the Palisades, some of the homes are newer, so there was less lead, less asbestos, but they still had some very old homes, and I think Altadena has a lot more older homes there, which are going to face that problem long term.
I just want to add that in addition to what Dr. Al-Saig said, when you think about what I said about emergency room visits, right? So the respiratory, I think it's pretty understandable. Obviously, if you have hypersensitivity, you have asthma, COPD, but AMI, right? Why would you have more heart attacks because of this? Well, if you look at the literature, you'll see that exposure to wildfires, PM 2.5, increases oxidation, it increases inflammation, it activates the inflammatory system, it activates the platelets, it destabilizes plaques. So not just the stress of being exposed to a wildfire or potentially evacuating, it actually has effects on your physiology. So people in the acute phase, it's the people who are vulnerable, right? Who have clinical or subclinical coronary artery disease, or people who have respiratory issues, older people, children, pregnant women. So those are the ones who are most vulnerable in the acute phase. But the long phase, all of us are vulnerable, right? Because these exposure to wildfire has been shown to increase metabolic syndrome, hypertension, exacerbate congestive heart failure, cancer. So all of that is a long-term effect, but it really has the acute phase and then the chronic phase. So right now we kind of have an idea of what happened to the acute phase, and probably most of it has dissipated, but the chronic phase is the one that's unknown, right? Because wildfires are so episodic. Most of the studies on exposures and disease are done in polluted countries, right? Or looking at, ambient pollution, which is not the same as a massive dose of pollution, because at some point it will disappear in your blood, so it's not detectable anymore. But what long-term effect does it have? So that's an area that we're actively investigating.
Well, thank you all very much. I just want to commend the organizer on an excellent conference. I'm Hazem Al-Maligi. I'm a surgeon, vascular surgeon. I was talking to Nicole early that initially I felt it is not the classic way of submitting the participating, because it's a ticket and trophies and stuff like that. But it came extremely a good conference. The focus is not only good for women. Actually, this whole presentation is appropriately applicable to men. And I want to say that we all know how bad the pollution is and the fire is. You are the governor of California, or you are the chairman of the American Medical Association. What do you want us to do?
There you go.
Fortunately, right now, I'm not either of those. You know, I've been asked that question many times by patients, and it's much easier to give an answer than it is to actually really follow through. And what I mean by that is I live in the Palisades, so I lost my home. And it's very easy for someone to come and say, well, the safest thing to do is to move, pick up, move, and go somewhere else. That isn't reality. That's, you know, I have children, they go to school, we have jobs. Some people, granted, have enough money to be able to move and have a remote job. Not all of us can do that. So I don't know what the answer to that question is. And unfortunately, there is no correct answer. You know, the hope is that everyone follows through with what they're supposed to do, clean the soil, clean, you know, the communities like promised, and help rebuild. And the faster we rebuild, and we were just talking about this earlier, part of the problem with these organic compounds are they're in the soil, they're in the ashes, they're in the dust that are in the homes that are still standing. So part of the safest thing to do, besides clean up the homes that are standing, is to start paving the empty lots. And the sooner we do that, the safer it's going to be. So, you know, they promised a speedier permit process. I tell you, I haven't seen that yet, but hopefully it happens. And the only advice that I would hope they will follow through with is to help people rebuild as quickly as possible, because once everything is paved, it's going to be much safer than just empty soil.
Well, thank you very much. Just one last comment. This conference, I believe, can be a forum for raising the voices on behalf of healthcare professional and the patient to the regulator. And I urge you all to embrace that. And we all encourage you for that. Thank you very much.
We have an online question regarding the how long the acute phase lasts, and I'll say the second question.
Acute phase. So the acute phase typically lasts a few months, so I think we're past the acute phase. But if the question has something to do more with the toxins or the exposures, it really depends, right? So the PM 2.5, which is the one that's most studied, that's mostly dissipated by now a year later, right? But the things like heavy metals, for example. So one of the interesting things, I don't know, it's discussed here earlier, we're not only dealing with wildfire, right? We're dealing with WUI, wildland urban interface, which is different from just burning organic compounds, right? It's as I mentioned, asbestos, batteries, insulation, houses. So the exposures or the contaminants are quite different. So for example, in wildland urban interface, which is what we had in Altadena and Pasadena, there's a lot more heavy metals than what you would get in a straight, wildfire event. So, and heavy metals are known to hang around for a year or more. And sometimes in fact, in one study, the levels don't peak till 1 or 2 years later because of it stays in the soil, and then with rains come leaching, and it comes to the surface again with runoff. So it's one of these things where the acute phase may be, for the PM 2.5, it's only a few months because, you have the stress of all that oxidation, inflammation, all that stuff. But the longer term effects may be much longer because there will be peaks, as soil leaches and things come up to the surface. So that's kind of, depends on what compounds we're talking about.
Are there certain biomarkers in the blood that you look for to indicate toxic levels of chemicals?
So we have a partnership with the fire department. At Cedars, we have a research and a clinical pathway for our first responders. And for the research part, we've seen close to 1,000 of our brave firefighters in the clinical pathway. We've seen about maybe 200-300. So we will be checking like blood levels, but most of the time, when we ask our experts in these fields, the toxins don't last in the blood too long. So the best thing is if you have pre-exposure and post-exposure, immediate post-exposure blood. We have that for the general population because we have another large cohort called Embark, which are LA residents that we started during COVID. So we have pre-exposure and post-exposure blood, but typically they don't rise very high for very long. So that's the challenge, is that the detectable limits are not, at least in the blood, are not long lasting. So that's why it's hard to say, you've been exposed and your lead level has been elevated for a year. In the environment, it might be, but not so much in the blood, unless you have a really massive exposure.
You answered my question, but Cindy Johnson, are there any studies being conducted though, even at these different levels? Because what we're hearing in the news, and I'm not in the medical profession, so I'm sorry if this sounds very simple, but what we're hearing is, oh, there are particulates in the air. Oh, you're breathing it all the time. So if we're constantly breathing it, and this is constantly being put into our system and our blood, then is there even an effective way of testing? And is there anything in process to do so?
What you're saying is correct, but I think the media is not very accurate when they're explaining this. So all of these things, lead, chromium, whatever, nickel, all of these we have all the time everywhere. But in a certain form where they're covered with metal, they're safe. So they're all over your house, but they're at safe levels where you will not, yes, you may be exposed to it, but it's not harming you. Once it burns, and once the outer coating burns on whatever the handles of your cabinets, I mean, it's silly where all these things are, in the foam of your couches, in your mattresses, in your cars. Once it burns and that coat goes away and it becomes airborne, that's a whole different ballgame. So yes, we are exposed to it all the time. We're exposed to it in this room right now, but it's not at dangerous levels where any of us have to worry that we're inhaling it right now. And again, if we're talking about a one home burning down in Santa Monica, it's not a big deal. This is a completely different, unprecedented situation where 3 entire cities burned down. So these are thousands of homes and buildings and cars. So all of this being airborne now becomes a problem. It's not so much, yes, we are always exposed to it, but not to what we're exposed to in post fires.
I had a question for anyone on the panel. For those of us who have children who went back to Palisades High School after a year of being at the old Sears building here, they did independent environmental studies which showed that everything was safe. But for us parents, if we know there's still exposure because of everything you've said, what can we look for in children or grandchildren that maybe signs that there's something going on? I mean, teenagers are exposed to everything from screen time to, wireless ear. They're exposed to so many things, microplastics. How can we differentiate the environmental fire as well? Because this is right in our backyard here. So if there's any signs, symptoms us as parents should be looking for, it would be good to know. Thank you.
I can go first and you can finish, but again, this is a little bit more difficult to answer because we can take every heavy metal and look at all of the clinical features that a human being can show. With every single heavy metal, it's going to be something different. But honestly, the big ones are something that we've mentioned over and over. If your child has asthma and they're having more exacerbations than usual, God forbid if any of your kids have any kind of genetic heart issues and you're seeing more problems from that than usual. The big one really that people are worried about is lead. Lead is another one because there's a lot of older homes that had lead. Lead toxicity, you have to be exposed to it for a long period of time, and it's got to be a high level of lead that you're exposed to for at least, I mean, what the published papers and books say is at least 30 days. And when you're exposed to it, and if your lead levels are high enough, it's really neurologic issues. It's confusion, inability to focus in school, which for a teenage kid is not a very smart answer, but neuropathies, things like that are what you see with lead. I urge, with lead as well, we have to be careful in pregnant women and in breastfeeding women because it can go through the breast milk, and in pregnant women it can be very dangerous for the growing fetus. Those are the metal or heavy metal things that you have to think about. Now, again, you can literally look up any heavy metal and see what those warning signs are, but it's almost impossible to narrow it to a few features. The one thing I want to point out, and I always mention this in every one of my talks, the immediate exposure is horrible. The volatile organic compounds are horrible long term. But something that's always overlooked or not discussed is the mental aspect and the psychological aspect of what these kids went through. So if we're talking about specifically about kids from grade school, all the way to college age, they will have some psychological effect of these fires, and the younger they are, they exhibit those problems, the depression, the anxiety, the fear, in different ways than an adult would. So that's something that, in my opinion, is even more important to concentrate and to look out in your kids, especially the ones that once people start moving back. A simple question that my son asked me, which makes logical sense, is, well, if we move back, what's going to stop this from happening again? He's right. And I don't have an answer for that, but that's a way of expressing their fear. It's just a random question that he asked. So I just urge that everyone be careful of that and to look for that.
Yeah, I don't have much more to add from Dr. Alsaig. I agree that sort of the acute effects have passed, but the long-term exposure, I think that's one thing we need to watch out for. We talked about soil, right? Soil and water, right? So those are the sort of the repositories of all these, compounds that could potentially be toxic or carcinogenic. So long term, we will need to find out what happens to LA residents who have, so for example, in our study, we asked them, where were you during the Palisades fire? Where were you living, and did you have the luxury of moving to San Diego for a month after the fire, right? And relocation is the most effective way of reducing your risk of exposure, but not everyone, as Dr. Alsaig mentioned. But long-term effects, I think, is definitely important to look at. So again, just because a place has been cleaned and it's been certified doesn't mean that it's entirely free of toxins. So it's important to look at that. For children, particularly, like exposure to soil, like ingesting soil or inhaling soil, because children play in the dirt. So I think that's something that you might want to be careful about. I mean, I was telling Dr. Alsaig that if I was going to build my house in Palisades, I'd probably pave a lot of the surfaces. Because, again, grass is beautiful, but I don't know what's going to be in there, especially with rain and leaching. So it's something to think about long term. And then the other thing I want to mention is that the most vulnerable in our city or our county are those who have low socioeconomic status, right? Because they spend more time outdoors. They don't have access to N95. So, sir, like if I was the governor, I'll be like, make sure that everyone has access to N95s. Because if you're in construction or if you work outdoors and you have no access to these things, I can tell you a lot of workers use bandanas whenever these happen. That's nothing. you know? So having more access to PPEs, I think, is really important, especially for people who don't have the luxury of staying indoors with an air filter on, and educating people. There are also a lot of cultures where there are countries where they burn rubbish as part of normal day-to-day life. So some people are like, what's the big deal? We do that all the time in my country. We burn garbage all the time, right? But we know that that's not healthy at all. But, you know, so there's a false sense of security sometimes with these kinds of things.
Do you empower your patients to get HEPA filters in their house or to use the apps, or are there certain things that you validate as good things to get or things that you think are just excessive and unnecessary?
Definitely air purifiers are a good idea. And air purifiers are measured by something called MERV. And the MERV, the higher the number, the more it will stop particles. And smaller particles, the higher the number. So we recommend a MERV of 13 or higher. And those are not very expensive, and they're sold pretty much everywhere. But there, you know, it's very important to get, you don't have to get the highest number available, but anything higher than 13 is good. You know, water filters is not a bad idea in Los Angeles anyway. Whether or not you have the fires, I think it's good to filter the water that we're drinking. Again, hopefully, you know, we're kind of out of the acute phase, something that I used to tell patients, and when I speak with cleaning the ash, if you're going to clean the ash and the particles in your house, they have these HEPA vacuums, specialized vacuums for ash. I would use that, not just regular vacuums. What else? You know, if you're, again, this probably hopefully is not any of you guys, but, you know, again, we're fortunate, hopefully enough, to be able to hire people to do this. But if you're going to clean outside, it's best to wet the dirt so that it doesn't kick up in your face. Those are really the important things, especially, and then the PPEs, the N95, the goggles, everything else, you know, just be careful not to get scammed with everything else. Yeah.
I have a question. How about the hair dyes that people use and nail polish that they use in hair salons and all the sprays? Are people supposed to wear a mask when they're having, all these things happen? Also, people who live under high polar voltage, power lines, what are they? I mean, those are pretty bad, right?
Yeah, I personally don't know about the effects of hair dyes and aerosol sprays. I mean, I'm sure, but you make a good point that pollutants doesn't always come from the outside, right? So it's always easy to say, okay, seal up, stay indoors, close the doors, close the windows, and but you generate pollutants from cooking, from incense, from aerosols, as you point out, right? So it's not the perfect solution either, because some people will tell you, other people will tell you that you have to let your house breathe, open the windows, and let the fresh air in. Well, if it is fresh air, right? So it's sort of a no-win situation if you think about it. But certainly, you have to balance things, depending on what's going on. But certainly, if the AQI, the alcohol index, is bad, you should stay indoors and try not to use candles and incense or cook or vacuum and do all, because you're going to be inhaling that. Most of the environmental pollutants are at home, not necessarily outside, unless you spend most of your time outside. So you have to look at your indoor as well as outdoor. And then the other thing with the homes is a lot of homes are leaky, what you call leaky homes, because air is going through. So no matter how great your air filter is, it's only as effective. Somebody told me that the best air filter is that you go to a room that has no windows and you lock yourself in there, right? And just have the air filter do its job, because it's not leaky. But if you have a leaky home, like I do, because I live in a 100-year-old home with beautiful windows that are very leaky, you gotta decide, right, what your risk tolerance is. So, yeah.
Believe it or not, this will be our last question. We have another panel. It's going to be okay.
Hi. This is a question about communities where landfills are, like for your patients that live near Calabasas area, where all the fire areas took the debris, brought the toxic soil and everything, batteries, et cetera, and brought it there. How do you have your patients stay safe within a few mile radius of that landfill? Even though it's not active, it's not burning, it's buried there. And we just are curious about how that can affect heart health and health in general.
Again, I mean, you guys are asking very tough questions, and I wish there were easy answers. There's the unrealistic answer, which is it's best to move out of the area, and then the realistic answer, which is, you know, if there's dust and ash coming from these areas, it's safest to wear N95 masks around them. Are we going to live in a world where we're always wearing a N95 mask? The answer is no, and that's why there is no easy answer to your question. But you're right. I mean, just the trucks driving up Sunset to go to the 405, and I was watching them because I had to, you know, go meet with my contractor a few times, and there's dust and ash everywhere as they're driving. So yes, we are all going to be exposed, and like Dr. Tan said, it's just a matter of waiting to see what comes out of all of this in the future, unfortunately.
Just want to provide a quick add-on. So it depends on susceptibility and dose, right? So if you're a firefighter, unfortunately, it's a very big dose. So no matter whether you're susceptible or not, you're going to likely see some health effects. But if you're susceptible, then that's a personal choice you have to make. Does it really, you know, like people with a congestive heart failure, for example, or a really sensitive lung condition, I don't know if it's wise to stay in an area. I don't know about landfills. I'm not an expert, certainly, but the question is, does it go to the groundwater? I don't know that. I don't know what the science is if you have a landfill, because that's a concern, is that if it gets into the groundwater, then that's going to affect your water supply.
Yeah, I did have what I think is an important point I'd like to make. Robert Murs, cardiologist here. I think evidence-based is important. And unfortunately, a lot of what I'm hearing from you guys is fear-inducing. And so a question I would have is, what evidence do we have that there is heavy metal exposure in our population? For example, I worked outside at my home, which did not burn but had a lot of damage. I got a lead level. It was not detectable. I know I've discussed that with Nicole, not detectable. I know there's been media reports in firefighters of arsenic and other things. But in terms of the patients that you're seeing, are you measuring these heavy metals that keep coming up as something to be frightened about? Are we seeing this, or are we not seeing it? That's kind of my question. And then also, to what extent can we reassure people that need to go on with life?
I can start. So you're absolutely right that the evidence is lacking. And that's why I think we have this forum, right, to activate people, because to accept things on the surface, like it's low, therefore we don't have to worry about it, I think is not the right way to do it. I'm also not saying that we should all be fearful and move out of LA. I don't think that's what we're saying here, right? I think what we're saying is that be vigilant. And as healthcare professionals, for those of you who are practicing, it's our responsibility to monitor people's health. And if you're seeing a pattern, to report it, because that's really the only way. So at least our Cedars, our small contribution is that we do have these study, the EMBARK study, where we're going to be looking at people long-term, right? These are LA residents who we have pre-exposure blood, post-exposure blood. We have information on what zip code they were in, where they were when the fires start. So unfortunately, that evidence is going to be years in the making. But hopefully, you know, years from now, maybe when I'm retired, you know, we'll find out what really these effects are, and that will change policy. Research is what drives policy, and and change. Right now, we're kind of flying blind a bit, but this is an opportunity. By the way, what I was going to say is that World Trade Center, as referenced by Dr. Al-Sayegh, do you know when they started studying the World Trade Center exposure? 10 years after 9/11. That is, I think, shameful that we didn't take that opportunity. Otherwise, we would have had a lot more information now that we've been exposed, right? But there was no study that it was at least not a big study that followed the first responders from 9/11 until 2011, 2012. So that's one thing we're trying to change, is to get the first responders, the LA residents, study them and see what's going to happen to the exposures. And then hopefully our children and our children's children will be better off than we are.
Okay, Drs. Tan and El-Sayegh, thank you so much. It's a difficult subject to cover, and we are very, very grateful. Thank you for your time. Thank you. So for our last panel discussion, we're going to cover global approaches to toxins in our cardiology panel. We have Dr. Serena Vanderzee, Dr. Sanjay Rajagopalan, and Dr. Francesca Casalino. You guys could come to the stage. Same format as before. Dr. Vanderzee is our moderator. And if you have any questions, we'll pass around the microphone. There'll be online questions. And we have a hard stop at 3 o'clock and a few more raffles to give away. So let's get on with it.
Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. Let me start with a few practical questions that came up. How important is choosing organic food?
First, I think we have to sort of understand, I presume all of you are experts in organic produce, but just so that for a start, so that we understand we're speaking the same language, organic is a production method, right? So principally it refers to addition of pesticides, usage of antibiotics and animal feed, and various other chemicals not being added. So these things are not being done to the food. So it's a production type approach. From a cardiometabolic perspective, I would say the most important thing is the macronutrient and micronutrient quality of food, right? So let's put that out. That's the first decision point. So organic, to me, at least, factors in when you are talking about reducing your pesticide exposures, when you're trying to reduce antibiotic, non-GMO or GMO ingredients, and other things that you do to food. And specifically for me, the decision point is, where do I want to avoid those exposures? So if you want to avoid pesticide exposures, we talked about the dirty dozen today, and pesticide exposures might be particularly important in certain groups of individuals, pregnancy, children, rapid growth phases. You really want to avoid those types of exposures. I think it's less important for older individuals, not that that's not important, but from a pricing perspective, you have to balance nutritional quality with pricing and get the best bang for the buck. So to me, I would say the first decision point is don't compromise on nutritional quality. Always focus on fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, those types of things are important foods, right? Whole foods are important, right? On the other hand, if you want to make a decision point on whether it's worthwhile purchasing organic foods, you might want to choose, if you happen to be in one of these categories, or if you happen to be an individual that consumes a lot of meats, for instance, and you're in a rapid growth phase, it might be best to avoid non-organic foods because you get a lot of ingredients and you're consuming a lot of it. So I look at that as two important decision points. First is don't compromise on whole foods. And again, avoid ultra-processed foods. Whole foods is important. Secondly, organic becomes important in certain subgroups of individuals where these types of decisions can have big consequences in terms of health. Does that make sense? So that's the way I think about it. I don't know what you...
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add to that. I would say sort of going off of that for me, I don't think I've bought as much organic food as in the past 2 years since I've had a 2-year-old baby. So, and I am, and you know, babies eat a lot of berries, and that's in the dirty dozen. So that's something that I am spending way more money than I normally would on. And I think that that's a priority and an important thing for me. And so I think organic is more expensive, as he alluded to, and I think trying to figure out a way to balance that in your life is important. And then beyond that, I mean, I have a lot of patients, I ask every day what they eat in clinic, what their diet is. And a lot of people start off, well, I go to the farmer's market, I got a lot of organic, which is great, but I think it's also very important beyond that, sticking to sort of the traditional Mediterranean diet and what we eat from a cardiovascular standpoint is also really important in balancing all of that.
I like to say, I think organic, a blueberry is still better than an organic cookie.
Yeah.
Hopefully that puts things in perspective,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
I have a question regarding the olive oil. I saw on one of your scales, olive oil was on the good side of the food. So considering that olive oil is a big part of Mediterranean diet, good for cardiovascular health, olive oil was on the middle with the yellow dot. That kind of bothered me right away. Do you have any explanation about that? Or should we consider something when we buy olive oil, organic?
I think I'm the culprit. I had one of my slides, right?
Okay, perfect.
One of these. Not Serena, not Francisca. Okay. I don't know if I recall seeing a yellow dot, but maybe it was on the graphic that shows you environmental impact versus nutritional impact, right? So you're basically treading the balance between what's good for you from a health perspective and what's likely to be least environmentally. So I guess that's the balance we're talking about. Look, olive oil is good for you. In general, I think the cardiometabolic effects of monounsaturated fats are good. They're preferable to using something like polyunsaturated fatty acids, right? There's no question. There's good randomized controlled evidence to suggest that foods that are rich in monounsaturated fatty acids are good for you. But I think I'm not an expert in olive farming, quite frankly, so I don't know what the environmental consequences are, and maybe they consume a lot of water, I don't know, and they're typically grown in areas, right? You're from the area? Okay, yeah, so that might be it, but it's good for you from a cardiometabolic perspective. Agreed? Serena, you agree? Okay, Francis.
Okay. When you travel, should you research the water, buy bottled water, or travel with a filter?
Outdoors people, I don't know. I'm not an intrepid traveler with capsules. But the question was, should you filter water?
Or when you travel, should you research the water quality and where you're going?
Oh, I see.
And
I don't. I mean, it's a little too much. I mean, just imagine I'm already going through the new place that I'm trying to visit. On top of that, as long as it's a cleanly sourced water source and you trust. The source, I think it's generally okay, but I don't normally test the water.
How are we doing in terms of transparency and reporting in this country?
That's a great question. I would say this, look, I'm not an expert in food labels, but I will say a good friend, a colleague of mine, Dr. Mozaffarian, who does a lot of work in Tufts University, would say that we have some ways to go in terms of transparency. And transparency can mean a lot of different things. It's one to say, okay, here's the ingredients in a label, in a food, but if you bury it in fine print at the bottom of it, nobody's going to read it, right? So what good is that? So he's always been a proponent, and many European countries do it, but they make labeling, food labels, very easy to understand. So ultra-processed foods, in fact, come with a label that says, on a scale of, let's say green, yellow, and red colors, it's labeled red if it's ultra-processed. Okay, that makes it very easy for you to shop for foods because it's transparent, simple to understand. And you know this, you have radio ads that talk about labels, but they speed up the, the speed, and you can barely hear them. So it's like all of the bad stuff is speeded up, right? So labels are an equivalent of that. If you put that in fine print, nobody's going to read it. So I agree with Dr. Mozaffarian in terms of the FDA, and there's been recent changes in FDA, if you haven't followed the news lately, but the FDA is always, in charge of these types of, labeling, and it should be one of the, I guess it doesn't fall under the FDA, but the proponent is they should probably take much more of an active role in terms of food labels because it has health consequences.
I have a question. Back to the Clean 15. I noticed on the Clean 15 it had corn, and I was reading that corn, 85% of the corn that's produced in the U.S. is GMO. So I'm wondering what you feel about that. I try and eat mostly organic because, when you read stuff, sometimes I think I should just stop reading. So I'm wondering how corn is in the Clean 15 if it's mostly GMO, because as far as I know, GMO is really bad for us. So what do you feel about that?
So I would say my general understanding of the Clean 15 is, does that fruit or vegetable have some sort of encasing that's preventing you from having the pesticide directly on it? So if you think about corn, it's grown with a husk around it. And so when that comes off, that's that exposure of the corn that you're actually eating. Same with like an orange or a banana or something. Something like that is decreasing your exposure, where you think about kale or spinach or berries, there's no encasing. Leafy greens specifically have all those little nooks and crannies where it's really hard to clean them. So I think that's sort of what makes that distinction. I don't know if that's your impression as well.
That's my understanding as well, because it refers to fruits and vegetables that have low pesticide content because they have some sort of outer layer or protection that prevents them from high pesticide levels. So if you're trying to avoid pesticides, you would choose categories from Clean 15 because they have lower levels of pesticides.
I'm specifically asking about genetically modified.
GMOs, right. So yes, I mean, if you really feel that GMO foods ought to be avoided, then you would avoid many genetically modified forms of corn. And you're correct. Corn is, many strains of corn are genetically modified.
No, but as medical profession, I'm asking you,
Oh,
what do you
asking
think
me
of
whether
that?
I feel that, it's still the jury is out on that. I don't know how you guys feel. I mean, to a large extent, many of the strains, plant strains in this country are genetically modified. I don't even know how many of them are actually originally non-modified anymore, but the jury is out. I don't know the answer to that, quite frankly. Good question, though.
Hi, guys. I'm right here, back here as a patient. And as someone that's living with hypercholesterolemia and atherosclerosis, and very grateful to be under the care of the coolest and most collaborative Dr. Weinberg. So thank you so much. It's so great to find doctors that work with you and work where you are, not where they want to go. So I'm grateful for that. But I have a question about something that we haven't talked about much, and I hope that you can address. Dr. Sanjay, loved hearing about the forest bathing concept. I think I've been doing that since I was a kid for free, but I didn't know that there was a name for it so now I'm going to tell all my friends. In a recent article, I read that AI data centers are coming for your land, your water, and your power. I think they forgot about your health as well. So how do we prepare for this new species that's about to take over our land and our lives? That's my question.
I have two words for you. Elon Musk. He's sending them out to space, so you don't have to worry about it. No, jokes apart. So you're right. I mean, data centers are taking up large amounts of land because that's what it takes. They also cause a lot of, they've had renewed demand for fossil fuels energy sources because they use natural gas, and now they're talking about nuclear, and now they're thinking about space because they want to send AI satellites and data centers to space so that they don't take up your land, right? So that's a problem, but it's a general problem with arable land throughout the world, right? I mean, there's a marked increase in deforestation. I would look at those conventional areas of opportunity before. Clearly, I think AI, hopefully, and data engineering is going to make our lives more efficient. There are obviously other problems, but I would say a much larger problem is deforestation in Africa, in the Amazon, in parts of this country, where, you know, land that could be used for nature purposes or habitat preservation is being destroyed, right? That is a concern, and it's a complex question. It's a balance between what we need to do to move forward as a civilization and to use lands appropriately. So I don't know if I have a good answer for you, but the first answer is probably, you know, just a joke, by the way. So.
Me? Okay. So for those who want to grow their own produce, taking a step back, what do we need to look at in terms of getting soil? If you're buying it in a bag, then you're buying it in a plastic bag. And if you're buying it in a plastic bag, then what are we supposed to look for on that bag? This may be way too specific, but it just seems like if we're going to try to control what we're eating with a raised bed, perhaps not in the ground, that at least we can control that one raised bed. And that one raised bed gets, you know, full of toxins or whatnot, we get rid of it and we resupply. So is there anything out there about where the best place is to get soil, or anyway?
I think that's why I have a nervous cough, as you see, because that's entering areas of expertise that I don't possess. Maybe I'll punt this to my esteemed colleagues here.
Yeah, I mean, I also am not an expert. My husband does some landscaping. He has his own company, and he likes to focus on organic and native. I would say there are large, and so going off what he's told me when I'm listening to his projects he's putting together, there are areas where you can go to get sort of where they're chipping up trees, et cetera, where you could get it right directly from the source. I couldn't tell you where that would be, but I do know that those facilities exist. And there are, I mean, yes, a lot of these soils are coming in bags, but there are soil that is more based on organic without any sort of chemicals, et cetera. And I think this is something that sort of goes back into the last panel, but I did want to make a comment that he's been looking into regarding sort of the soil concern with the wildfires. There are certain plants that you can plant in your soil in your garden that are supposed to leach up some of the heavy metals, et cetera, and toxins, sunflowers being one of them. So I recommend everyone plant sunflowers.
Thanks. While we're waiting, okay, let me just ask one from the online audience, and then we'll take some more from our audience here. What do you think have been the biggest policy successes and the greatest opportunities?
I think the biggest policy success in this country are, I think, two. I think air pollution regulation and lead policy impact. Huge results and huge payoffs in terms of improving children's cognition, even IQ scores in this country, avoidance of hypertension and cardiovascular disease for lead, and for air pollution, clearly incredible benefits in health with return on investment in terms of money that's put in to enact regulation, right? So it's got a very good ROI, if you will. So those are two good examples.
And what are you excited about, or what do you see as a big opportunity?
I think it's clearly clean energy. It's transformative, just like AI. It's like incredible, and I often scratch my head when I think about folks opposed to it. It's so stupid at multiple levels, but it's a phenomenal opportunity because it has health impact, number one, and every experiment that people have done have shown that it's a good return on investment. So if you spend $1 in clean energy, it pays back in terms of jobs, number one. Economics. So people who oppose this have no idea, and maybe there are folks in the audience, but I'd like to reach out to you to say it makes perfect economic sense, it makes good health sense, so it's a huge opportunity. And we don't want to lose competitive advantage to, countries around the world that are taking this on. So if you're locally connected to politicians and folks who might listen, please do reach out and tell them that this is not good policy. This is not good industrial policy to go back to coal mining or fossil fuels when the rest of the world is shifting at a rapid pace.
Amen.
Yeah,
Just to the side of that, I just have a worry with lithium batteries and what we need for lithium, and also the effects of lithium fires and the car you drive or in your home or that type of thing in your pocket. That's the thing that really scares me.
So I presume that's a comment? Yeah, right, okay.
Yeah, I don't know that what we can do with clean energy with that as an aside.
Yeah, I think let me address that, because this is a question that often comes up where they say, well, clean energy. And we all admit that the cost of some of the metals involved in clean energy and decarbonization do come at a huge environmental cost. And I'll readily admit, and it should be said, and thanks for bringing it up, that the other side of it is that many of the decarbonization or clean energy technologies also involve risk, and environmental risk, and sometimes even unknown human risk. But the difference there is there's at least an attempt at recycling some of these entities, right? Batteries can be recycled. They don't go into a... Normally, people thinking about these things are also thinking about the cycle of using those materials back. So that is spurring innovation in the area of reuse of these materials back in a closed loop so that they don't go back into the environment. And that's usually the case. I mean, car batteries are not going to go back into a dust heap or dump somewhere in Arizona, right? They're typically taken back and reprocessed. So this type of closed loop mechanism where you recycle earths, rare metals, and batteries, et cetera, makes sense to me. But it is a good point. It must be acknowledged that we don't understand some of the large scale. For instance, I mean, if you're thinking about sourcing these metals from Congo and there's environmental degradation and stuff that, we're not paying for that. That country is paying for it. There's negative externalities of these types of decisions that's sometimes hard to calculate, right? But it's a very good point.
Yeah, I think there was a plant that recently blew up that was making these things, and then all of the pollutants were going into the air. That was very frightening.
It is frightening.
I might be wrong.
Thank you all very much. The focus today was jet particles can be in the macrophages, but also it can be in macrophages in the lung. Does that have oncogenic effect, cancer development? If you're exposed to fire for 2, 3, 4 weeks, the damage happens and it can cause effect over years. Is that a possibility, number one?
It is, of course. I mean, there's an extensive literature linking exposures like air pollution to lung cancer. No question. And we know that it's, in fact, one of the most important causes. Let's go ahead.
Go ahead.
So, but on a scale of events, the number of cardiovascular events outtrumps the number of cancers. But it is absolutely an important metric for some of these exposures.
Yeah. The other issue is we all try to look for safety. We buy bottled water. How safe are they?
Well, I think in general, I would say that you're referring to plastic exposures with water bottles. The answer is I don't know what the risk is. I would say, on my slide, I would say weathered plastics or plastics that have been degraded are probably more risky than drinking out of a water bottle. But having, you have a choice. I saw a nice, obviously this is a pretty fancy hotel, and Dr. Weinberg and my colleagues from Pacific Heart Institute are putting us through a very luxurious experience here, sitting here. And if you've noticed, the water bottles that I had were aluminum, content. I love those bottles, right? They're reusable. But if you're in a closed loop, recyclable system, I don't think it's bad. Now, back in Ohio, I mean, I could drink out of a water bottle and put it into there's no recycling whatsoever. I don't know what happens to, water. So I don't normally, I take my own bottles, right? So I don't take. So in general, it's a good practice not even to use plastic bottles, number one. But on a scale of things, I would say the preferable thing to do would be not to use plastic bottles, use something else. You take your own bottles, recycle, wherever possible. But if you happen to live in a place, or if you're traveling, it's not the end of the world if you drink out of a plastic water bottle.
Yes, thank you. So a question I actually had was just more on the clinical end. So we've had a lot of discussion about mechanisms and how that can drive cardiovascular risk, and even sort of gone into some of the therapeutic avenues as well. But I'm thinking more along the lines of translating this clinically, and I'm curious because you made this excellent comment rooted in the literature about lead, cadmium, and arsenic specifically, and how those can have impact for health and maybe even on the cardiovascular realm. So my question is specifically, at what point do we look at those levels in a clinical setting? How routinely should they be checked? Or is there evidence to check them at all in terms of being able to drive action? Because right now, I do know at least one or two primary care doctors in our community who sort of check this at large. And some people would feel that's a little fringe. Others might think that maybe he's onto something. Don't want to give out names. So, there's varying opinions. And of course, as this becomes a more prominent issue in cardiology and in medicine, these questions are going to come up. So I'm just curious, where are we in terms of the diagnostic aspect?
Maybe I should take this. Yeah. So I would say I don't know if you noticed, I had a slide. It was very busy, but it went through what do clinicians do with this information, right? Do you start, look, we all have, as a physician, I can say I have a fairly busy practice. I want to really focus on things that can make a big difference for you today, right? So when you have a 40-minute appointment, if I spend 20 minutes talking about an esoteric exposure, environmental exposure that might have no consequence to your health, I'm not going to do that, just to make sure. So what I do is focus on what I can do to change your, and I think that's the practice of most of my colleagues. You focus on the known knowns and focus on things that you know how to lower risk, okay? Now, having said that, now let's move past that. There's a lot that we know as cardiologists that many patients that I see, and I'm sure this is the case with you all, when they're sent to you, they're not optimized. You could push their LDL cholesterols a little lower. I could lower your hemoglobin A1C, do a little bit better, and there's a little bit of fine-tuning, shall we say, that can happen. So I do that. But then, if there are young patients who have risk factors and something called SMRF, this is patients who have a heart attack because they don't lack the standard modifiable risk factors. They're referred to as SMRFs, SMRFs. So if you don't have standard modifiable risk factors and something going on, that, tweaks my attention. I say, should I be getting something else, right? So in those patients, I might consider these types of things. But generally speaking, if you live in an area, so that's one aspect. So if I see an atypical patient who otherwise has no other modifiable risk factors, I think about environmental exposures like cadmium, arsenic, nickel, etc. The other situation is an environment where you know that these exposures are very common, right? If it happens to be a wildfire, in Ohio we've had wildfires, from Canada coming over, and people want to know. So when you have a raging wildfire, it's probably appropriate to talk about that with your patients. So that's another opportunity. But I don't routinely talk about environmental exposures because of time constraints and just, So I choose where I have to spend my time effectively.
So my question is about environmental toxins and would you recommend organic food? There are some environmental toxins we have no control over, like the fires that happened, or the federal government we're with right now. Those are environmental hazards we can do nothing about. But we can eat organic food. So why wouldn't we do something that makes a difference? Like, we have a choice of smoking or not smoking. Yes, it's an addiction and it's difficult and people struggle. But eating organic food helps. Or exercise. Why wouldn't we do what we can do and, let the other things, we learn to cope with them or find changes in them. But I just feel like it's so important to eat organic food, if we can. So that's just a comment.
Thank you.
I have a question. I don't know if this is true, but if you can't get organic food, they say you could put vinegar, white vinegar in water, and leave the unorganic food in it for like about a half hour, and it helps pull out the pesticides. Is that true? I heard that from a health inspector.
I did that. I did that with blueberries and grapes.
Is that true?
Yeah, and soaked them in vinegar.
I would say generally, to your comment, I think the question of organic foods, is also sometimes an economic issue for some people. Like where I live, a lot of people can't buy them because they can't afford them. It's much cheaper to buy, certain types of foods. But that aside, I think soaking, the dirty dozen, for instance, in large amounts of water. I don't know about vinegar. Maybe it has the acidic quality, has some effects on leaching out certain other things. But in general, if you soak it, it does, and leave it for a while, it does take out some of the pesticides. Yeah.
Hi, everybody. My name is Julie Swift. I'm probably the only dietitian in the audience, registered dietitian here. I'm a professor at LMU. I've been teaching nutrition for 20 years. So I just want to say eating fruits and vegetables is way more important than getting organic, okay? Eat your fruits and vegetables. Go to the farmer's market. We have a wonderful farmer's market here in Santa Monica. Some of the farmers are not organic because it is very expensive for farmers to produce organic fruits and vegetables. And just one farmer, he dropped his status after 17 years because of the paperwork. So if you're buying fruits and vegetables, you're there at the farmer's market. Don't worry about them being organic, okay? There is a controversy on the EWG's Dirty Dozen. I have to put it out there. Dr. Andrea Love, she's an immunologist and a microbiologist. She basically says it doesn't have tough scientific rigor. I used to teach it, but I haven't been because the bottom line is most Americans do not get enough fruits and vegetables. And what we find is that when we tell people buy organic, it makes them eat less fruits and vegetables overall. Now, if you have the privilege of buying organic berries, go for it. I do that for my family. I have that privilege. But most Americans, there's so many Americans that go hungry. So I just have to put it out there that eat more fruits and vegetables. You'll be in a much better place. Don't worry about the minutia of is this organic or is that organic. Really think about the quality of your diet in general and not just about it being organic. And then as far as washing, but vinegar does help. If you wash your vegetables in water and vinegar, you don't even need to spend money and buy those fancy sprays or anything like that. So I just want to say thank you to you guys and all the toxins out there, fire victim here. So definitely want to know if there's any specific chemicals I need to be testing for before I move back into my house. And I love that you guys are talking about plastics because I probably bought my metal water bottle 20 years ago. But then before that, I used to have water bottles in my hot car, as a dietitian. So the other thing I wanted to say is try not to worry about what you can't control, right? I can control the water bottle I have. I can't control, that there was this wildfire. So thank you.
Great comment.
I did want to make a comment about something we haven't talked about, if that's okay, in line with things you can control and can't control. How many people in this room order from Amazon? So if you think about how many packages are traveling around the world because of online shopping, how many fossil fuels are going into that, how much carbon dioxide is going into the environment from that, the particles, and then think about all the packaging that goes along with that. And then where does a lot of this stuff go? How many of you then go to Whole Foods a few days later and return that package? And most of the time, those packages go to a facility where it's not then sent to someone else. It's just put in a huge trash heap that's transferred to some country in the world that accepts trash and affecting their environment and their water sources and the air they breathe. And so I think something that we can all do, that we do have complete control over, and I know that it's not easy, and I know that conveniences drives all of this, and we have enough stuff that we're dealing with in our lives. But I think trying to make a conscious effort to decrease your online shopping, and I know the world is not making it easy because there aren't a lot of stores anymore to go shopping at, but I think that's something that we can all make an effort to do and would have a huge impact.
And yeah, so to underscore the principle of do what you have control over, what's good for you, and from a health standpoint, and likely the reverberations of that for your community and your planet will follow. So I think we'll end unless anybody has any other questions.
Lot of 18 to 31-year-olds right out of, they're at UC Davis, they're undergrads and they're grad students. And I have, in the 23 years I've practiced, seen a complete difference in the young adult health. Definitely 1 in 3 have prediabetes, they're overweight, they're stressed, of course, and they're not eating great. And I can feel very overwhelmed on how to help them. So I'm backing it up because now I feel really well prepared when our wildfires hit, because they always do up there. I know what to tell them and whatever, we can move on. But it's the other toxins, like the stress, the food, the lack of exercise. And so my question's twofold. I would love to hear how I could help you guys, not have to see them down the road. Like, where can I get the biggest bang for my buck with them? Because it can feel super overwhelming to me. And then the second thing is, the 18 to 44-year-olds now trust sometimes TikTok providers over us. And so something that we try to do in our system is to find these links that we can send them that are reputable, and once they trust us, they will follow these people and listen to what they're saying. So my question is, what can I do to help you? And then number 2, do you guys have any recommendations of reputable TikTokers? I'm not on TikTok, so I don't even know how that works, but, or websites. Like, I always tell them to go to the Mayo Clinic. I should probably tell them to go to the Kaiser sites, but whatever. I like Mayo's. So anyway, I'd love to hear from you guys.
I would say bang for your buck is exercise to reduce stress, to improve your, metabolic standpoint. I know that's not, I'll say that to half of my patients and they're like, I don't like exercise. So I always try and figure out a way to say, what if you can improve however you can, that's going to help you. And you want to figure out something that you enjoy, because if you don't enjoy it, it's not going to be sustainable. So figuring out some way to be active is going to have huge benefits for stress, your weight, your cardiovascular profile. No.
I appreciate it. It's hard to say you need to do your diet, you need to manage your stress, and you need to exercise. So I'm like, where do I start here?
I think, with apologies to our healthcare system, because they should be really rewarding folks like you for spending the time, because you're in every sense of the word the frontline folks dealing with primordial prevention, right, where before it becomes manifest. So hopefully there will be changes in incentivizing primary care providers so that they can spend more time with their patients, number one. It is very overwhelming because you have to cover a lot of ground, in addition to what you're doing with your patients. But I think working in teams sometimes, and again, it's complicated because we have a cardiometabolic program that we run for individuals who have disease, where we have a structured approach where we have an exercise trainer, a dietitian that can take the load off and give them tips while you can advise them on certain things. So it really takes the pressure off of me because I don't have to spend 30 minutes talking about diet, which is a foundation of everything that we do, and exercise, right? So maybe creative ways of create a practice model where you can essentially engage other alternate care providers that can take the stress off is one way to do it. But the catch there is, how do you incentivize and develop economic models where that becomes affordable for you as a practice, right? So, I mean, but Kaiser, I mean, you work for Kaiser, right? So you can certainly put together, and Kaiser is all about primordial prevention. So thinking about this in a way in which it offsets some of the time that you commit through a team-based approach can have better success, I think. So I don't know. Yeah.
I don't have any recommendations on TikTok. I'm also not on TikTok. Rigvid, do you have any ideas?
There was a recent study. I don't know, I could not give you the citation right now because I don't have that memorized. Only 2% of nutrition information provided on TikTok is accurate. So it's accurate. So 98% of nutrition information provided on TikTok is inaccurate. So I teach college students, I'm getting this. The amount of misinformation that comes to me is crazy. So there is a dietitian, and she has a PhD in nutrition also, Dr. Jessica Nurick, K-N-U-R-I-C-K, or Dr. Jess on TikTok. She's also on Instagram. I had to download TikTok last week because of a new client. And there's also Dr. Iz. He is a doctor in the UK, so he's MBBS. Dr. IDZ. But I wrote this down for you, and I can give it to you to give to your younger clients, because this is the way that the young people are getting their information. And again, 98% false nutrition information on TikTok, and it's everywhere. The best advice is to, not go on TikTok, right? Set that limit for yourself. So that's why my daughter doesn't have it.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate the panelists' time and expertise.
Thank you, Serena. Thank you, Francis.
Thank you.
That was better than I could have imagined. Thank you so, so much. As many of you are aware, we are a charity that supports other charities. This year, we felt compelled to bookend last year's donation to the Widows and Orphans and Disabled Firefighters Fund with a gift to an organization which rose like a phoenix from the ashes of the tragic fires that affected our community. As a women-centered organization, we are touched by the work and mission of the Altadena Girls. They are a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing a safe, supportive, and joyful community space for teenage girls aged 13 to 17 in the San Gabriel Valley, particularly for those impacted by the Eaton Fire. Founded by Lauren Sandridge and her daughter Avery Calvert, its mission is to foster healing, connection, and empowerment through free programming in wellness, creative arts, music, and movement. We consider this gift an investment in the future of our community and hope that maybe there's a future cardiologist there. So cute. Whose passions through the diverse programs Altadena Girls offers. Today's event has been the result of a year of planning and over 13 years of support. We hope this is a catalyst to your renewed, healthy living, and may you continue to inspire us to push the envelope and tackle many more provocative topics. We want to thank everyone who made today possible, our volunteers, event staff, exhibitors, raffle and silent auction donors, our AV team, and Hotel Casa del Mar. We would also like to give a special thanks to our think tank members, generous donors, everyone watching on the live stream, and everyone who has been part of our efforts over the years. As they say, that's a wrap. Thank you.